Preface of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Wales. Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard RABY. Preface. The following sketch was written to supply what its author felt persuaded could not fail to interest his fellow Catholics in England, namely, some account of the only English pope who ever reigned. In it he does not pretend to any novelty of research, but simply to present a connected narrative of such events in the history of Pope Adrian IV as have hitherto lain broken and concealed in old chronicles, or been slightly touched for the most part in an incidental way by modern writers. In the course of his sketch, the author has ventured to take part with Pope Adrian in some acts of his, which it is commonly the mode to condemn. Should his opinions in so doing not be deemed sound, he yet hopes that at least the spirit which inspired them, in other words, the spirit to promote the cause of practical rather than theoretical policy, as also of public order and legitimate authority, will deserve commendation. For the rest, the striking similarity between the difficulties which Pius IX in our day has to contend with, and those which Pope Adrian had to encounter in the 12th century, should only lend the more interest to his story. R.R. Munich, May 1849. End of preface. Chapter 1 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard RABY. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. The information which has come down to us respecting the early life of the only Englishman who ever sat on the papal throne is so defective and scanty as easily to be comprised in a few paragraphs. Nicholas Breakspere was born near St. Albans, most probably about the close of the 11th century. His father was a clergyman who became a monk in the monastery of that city while his son was yet a boy. Owing to extreme poverty, Nicholas could not pay for his education and was obliged to attend the school of the monks on charity. This circumstance would seem to have put his father so painfully to the blush that he took an unnatural dislike to his son, whom he shortly compelled by his threats and reproaches to flee the neighborhood in a state of utter destitution. Thus cruelly cast on the world, Nicholas to settle the church in those remote countries where it had been planted about 150 years. The circumstances which led to this legation were as follows. Originally, the three kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway were spiritually subject to the Archbishop of Hamburg, whose province was then the most extensive in Christendom. In the year 1102, Denmark succeeded, after much protracted agitation of the question, in obtaining from Pope Paschal II a metropolitan see of its own, which was founded at Lund, and to whose authority Sweden and Norway were transferred. The same feeling of national independence which had procured this boon for Denmark was not long before it began to work in those kingdoms also, and the more so as the Danish supremacy was asserted over them with much greater rigor than had formerly been that of Hamburg, and was otherwise repugnant to them as emanating from a power with which they stood in far closer political relations and more constant rivalry than with Germany. After some indirect preliminary steps in the business, which do not seem to have forwarded it, the kings of Sweden and Norway sent ambassadors to Pope Eugenius III to request for their states the same privilege which his predecessor had granted to Denmark, and which he himself had also extended to Ireland in the erection of the 4 archbishoprics of that country. The arrival of these ambassadors at Rome happened a year before the elevation of the abbot of St. Rufus to the see of Albano. The Pope promised to accede to their request. It was in fulfillment of this promise that Nicholas Breakspere was sent into the north. Doubtless the circumstance of his being an Englishman had weight in his selection, as, in consequence of that circumstance, he would be viewed as far more likely to possess a correct knowledge of the character and government peculiar to northern nations than an Italian. Taking England in his way, the cardinal legate passed thence into Norway, where he landed in June of the year above mentioned. The country was then governed by 3 brothers named Sigurd, Ing, and Eystein, sons of the late King Harald Gille. Between the first 2 a serious quarrel happened to rage, for a Norwegian nobleman having murdered the brother of Sigurd's favourite concubine, and then entered the service of Ing, the latter shielded his client against the punishment which Sigurd sought to inflict. Before entering on the affairs of the Church, the cardinal legate saw that this quarrel must first be settled. Of the 3 brothers, Ing seemed to have stood the highest in the esteem of all classes in the state, by reason of his benevolence and other virtues. With him the cardinal took part, and compelled Sigurd, together with Eystein, who seems also to have meddled in the dispute against Ing, to agree to a reconciliation. At the same time he visited with ecclesiastical censures the former 2 for various crimes, of which they had been guilty in other respects. On the settlement of this quarrel, he proceeded at once to the special business of his legation, the erection of an archbishopric for the kingdom. This he decided to fix at Nidrosia, or Nidaros, the capital of the province over which Sigurd in those days ruled, and corresponding to the city and district of Drontheim now. The selection of Nidrosia was made chiefly out of honour to St. Olaf, whose relics reposed in its church. Here he invested John, Bishop of Stavanger, with the pallium, and subjected to his jurisdiction the sees of Apslo, Bergen, and Stavanger, those of the small Norwegian colonies of the Orcades, Hebrides, and Furro Isles, and that of Gard in Greenland. The Shetland and Western Islands of Scotland, with the Isle of Man, and a new bishopric which the cardinal founded at Hammer in Norway, and in which he installed Arnold, at that time expelled the See of Gard, were also included in the province of Nidrosia. The Bishop of Sodor and Man, as well as the bishops of the Shetland and Western Isles, had still this time been suffragans of the See of York, but obeyed the authority of Nidrosia for the next 200 years. After which the Norwegian primate lost his rights over those islands, which returned under their first jurisdiction. The greater part of the other sees had already, directly or indirectly, acknowledged the authority of the bishops of Nidrosia, while the rest had bowed to the supremacy of Hamburg. The possession of a metropolitan see of their own spread such satisfaction among the people of Norway, that no mark of respect seemed too great for the immediate dispenser of the boon, and under this feeling they allowed the cardinal legate to introduce various regulations into the country beyond what his powers entitled him to do, and even to reform their civil institutions. Thus there is every reason to assume, though positive historical evidence is wanting, that he bound the Norwegian Church to the payment of Peter's pence to the Holy See. He also effected extensive reforms as regards the celibacy of the clergy, but in spite of his great influence does not seem to have been able to carry them so far as he could have wished. Various rites and ceremonies of religion, into which abuses had crept, were purged by him. Moreover, he placed the public peace on a surer footing than it was before, by means of a law which he procured to be passed, forbidding all private persons to appear armed in the streets, while to the king alone was reserved the right of a bodyguard of 12 men. Snorro relates that no foreigner ever came to Norway who gained so much public honour and deference among the people as Nicholas Breakspeare. On his departure he was loaded with presents, and promised perpetual friendship to the country. When he became pope, he kept his promise, and invariably treated all Norwegians who visited Rome during his reign with extraordinary attention. He also sent into Norway architects and other artists from England to build the cathedral and convent of the new see of Hammer. On his death the nation honoured his memory as that of a saint. Having finished the business of his legation to Norway, Nicholas Breakspere next passed into Sweden. His first proceeding in this kingdom was to hold a synod at Linköping, to fix on a see for the new archbishopric about to be created. But the members, consisting of the heads of the clergy of Sweden and Gotland, could not agree on the point, as, out of a spirit of provincial rivalry, the one party claimed the honour for Upsala and the other for Skara. Finding that the dispute was too hot to be soon settled, the cardinal legate consecrated St. Henry of Upsala, bishop of that city, introduced various new regulations respecting the celibacy of the clergy and the payment of Peter's pence to the Pope, and then took his departure for Denmark on his way to Rome. The pallium, which was destined for the new primate of Sweden, he deposited until the difficulties in the way of the election of that dignitary should be removed, with Eskil, Archbishop of Lund, who received him in the most honourable and cordial manner, notwithstanding that by his agency the authority of the Danish Church was so seriously curtailed. The cardinal legate would seem to have sought by this act of confidence to soothe the soreness which Eskil must naturally have felt at seeing his honours so shorn. The primate of Lund was also informed that he should still continue to preserve the title of primate of Sweden, with the right of consecrating and investing with the pallium the future archbishops of that kingdom. Farther, he was promised, as some compensation for what he had lost, the grant of a right from the Holy See of annexing to his archiepiscopal dignity the style of legate nati apostolici sedis in the three kingdoms. During the stay of Nicholas Breakspere in Denmark, it happened that John, a younger son of Sverker's, king of Sweden and Gotland, and a prince whose radically bad character had been totally ruined by a neglected education, carried off by violence, and dishonoured the wife of his eldest brother Charles, together with her widowed sister, princesses of unsullied fame, and nearly related to Sweno III, at that time king of Denmark. This atrocity naturally excited a deep resentment against its author at home and abroad, and roused Sweno to resolve on invading Sweden and Gotland with all his forces in revenge of so insulting an outrage. A resolution in which he grew all the more fixed by the recollection that Sverker himself had formerly injured Nicholas, a predecessor of Sweno on the throne, by perfidiously seducing and marrying his intended bride, an injury all the bitterer, as Nicholas never could retaliate it, by reason of domestic broils with his own people. The cardinal legate no sooner became aware of this gathering storm than he sought to avert its outbreak, and repaired to King Sweno, to whom he remonstrated against the projected war, not only on religious but prudential grounds, depicting to him the many serious obstacles by sea and land which must be surmounted before any advantage could be won, and reminding him that if the spider by disemboweling herself as least caught the flies she gave chase to, yet the Danes could only expect to run the certain peril of their lives in their proposed campaign. The cardinal's interference in this instance in behalf of peace seems not to have been crowned with the same success as in Norway. King Sweno, a proud and obstinate man, lent a respectful but callous ear to his arguments, and was equally impervious to the efforts of the ambassadors whom Sverker also sent to prevent hostilities. The events of the war which followed brought condign punishment to each party, for Prince John, on being directed by his father to levy troops for the defence of the state, was massacred in a popular riot as the odious cause of the public dangers, and Sweno, on his invasion of Sweden, having been inveigled by the wily tactics of Sverker, who feigned to retire before him, to push his expedition beyond its original destination as far as Finland, was there surprised by a rising of the natives, who destroyed the flower of his army, while he himself escaped with difficulty into Denmark, covered with shame at so ignoble and fatal a defeat. Not long afterwards, Sweno was murdered in his bed by two of his chief nobles, who had long cherished disloyal feelings towards their king, and at last entered into a treasonable correspondence with Sverkus. The end of the latter proved eventually not less tragical. In the meantime, Nicholas Breakspere had quitted the country and returned to Rome. On his arrival he found Pope Eugenius dead, and succeeded by Anastasius IV, an old man of 90. Anastasius, who reigned little more than a year, among other acts, confirmed by a bull addressed to John, Archbishop of Nidrosia, all that the English legate had done in Norway, with the exception, however, of that concession to the primate of Lund, by which the latter was to enjoy the right of investing the new archbishops of Norway and Sweden with a pallium. This right Anastasius reserved to the Holy See. The venerable pontiff died shortly afterwards, December 2, 1154. On the following day the conclave met in St. Peter's Church, and elected the Cardinal Bishop of Albano to the vacant throne, in which he was solemnly installed on the morrow, and took the name of Adrian IV, thus giving not the least striking among many examples in the dynasty of the popes of an exaltation from the meanest station in society to one of the sublimest in dignity, and most awful in responsibility, that exists under heaven. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. At the moment Adrian IV took his seat behind the helm of Peter's bark, the winds and waves raged furiously against her, nor ceased to do so during the whole time that he steered her course. That time, though short, was yet long enough to prove him a skilful and fearless pilot, as much so as the very foremost of his predecessors or successors, who have acquired greater fame than he, simply because a more protracted term of office enabled them to carry out to completer results than he could do, designs in no wise loftier than Adrian's, and in so doing to unveil before the world more fully than was permitted to him, characters not therefore nobler or more richly endowed than his. The first difficulty with which the English Pope had to grapple on his accession to power was the refractory spirit of the citizens of Rome, among whom Arnold of Brescia had, some time before, stirred up the republican mania. Arnold was a native of the city, indicated by his surname, and was born there most likely about the year 1105. His was one of those proud and ambitious natures in which imagination and enthusiasm are mixed up in far greater proportions than judgment and sobriety. From his childhood he developed shining parts and an ardour for study, calculated to elicit their full force. To pursue his studies with as little interruption as possible, he adopted, while yet a boy, the clerical habit, and not long afterwards obtained minor orders. In those days events were passing at home and abroad, well adapted to excite all that extravagance, which was to be expected from a character like his. In Italy it was the era of the spread of those republican principles which were at last fought out so heroically and through such perils by the cities of Lombardy against local barons and transalpine emperors. In Europe at large it was the era of the bloom of intellectual chivalry, whose seat was Paris, whose foremost champion Abelard. But it was also the era of a widespread demoralization of the clergy, among whom simony and concubinage were the order of the day, and consequently every other disorder which naturally follows in the wake of those two capital vices. In the midst of such a complicated state of things, requiring so much steadiness of eye to view it properly so as not to be misled, on the one hand by a false admiration and on the other by a false disgust, The youth, Arnold, devoured the pages of Livy, and imbibed from him, as well as from other Roman classics, those principles of heathen republicanism which he subsequently sought to restore to practice in the metropolis of Christendom, with such fatal results to society and himself. On the completion of his studies at home, he repaired, thirsting for deeper draughts of knowledge, to Paris, and became one of the most devoted scholars of Abelard, whose rationalist invasions of the domain of theological doctrine, by which the supreme authority of the Church in matters of faith was threatened, accorded with Arnold's tone of mind. In fact, he soon arrived, by the line of argument which the lessons of his master and his own feelings led him to adopt, at the firm persuasion that he alone had hit upon the true plan for reforming not only the political but the religious abuses of the age, and, moreover, that none but he could carry that plan out. Under this hallucination, which the fumes of pagan principles of statesmanship and rationalist principles of Christianity, fermenting together, had hatched in his brain, he returned, after a few years' stay at Paris, to Brescia, not failing to visit, at his passage of the Alps, the Waldenses and other sects with whose tenets he secretly sympathized. On his arrival at Brescia, he opened his career by a series of pulpit philippics against the temporal government of the prince-bishop and the immoral lives of the clergy. With fiery eloquence that told all the more by reason of the sanctity of the preacher's exterior, a precaution which he took so well that even St. Bernard admitted its success, Arnold opposed the doctrines and practice of Holy Writ to the vices and luxuries which he denounced, affirming that the corruption of the Church was caused by her having overstepped the boundaries of her domain. That she had done so was proved, he said, by the wealth and political power which she had acquired, contrary to the spirit and example of apostolic times, to whose simplicity she must return if she was to be reformed as she ought to be, and as, for the good of society, it was indispensable she should be. Of course, this line of argument received all that applause which it never fails to do whenever urged, for the reformation of the Church, by reducing her to the poverty of the apostolic ages, involves, besides such purely spiritual advantages as are set forth at large in the plan, others of a material kind, which, if not usually paraded with the first, are not the less kept steadily in view. For instance, that those who carry out the reforms in question will be sure to get well paid for their pains, seeing that the transaction necessarily passes so much money and goods through their fingers, as well to private as public profit. And then there is the secret satisfaction, naturally felt above all by the rich and lax, at seeing the clergy, by means of this very reformation, deprived of much formidable influence, such as wealth always bestows on its possessors, and which is surely as necessary to the Church as to any other public corporation, to the end that she may carry out efficiently the affairs of her vast mission, keep up her dignity amid an irreverent world, shield her oppressed, relieve her poor members, and strike respect into powerful sinners, who would not only scorn but trample on her too, if she had nothing but words to oppose to blows. In consequence of Arnold's sermons, preached not only at Brescia but also in other towns of Lombardy, and which, besides their virulent censure of the existing abuses in Church and State, broached opinions contrary to orthodox faith, especially in regard to infant baptism and the sacrament of the Eucharist, an insurrection broke out against the Prince-Bishop Manfred in the year 1138, and lasted through the next. Manfred made a vigorous stand to begin with, then seemed on the point of giving way, when an unexpected event turned the scales in his favour. This was the calling by Pope Innocent II, in the year 1139, of all the bishops and abbots of the Church to an ecumenical council at Rome to condemn the memory of his late rival, the antipope Anacletus II. Among the rest, the Bishop Manfred and the abbots of Brescia appeared, and did not fail to seize the opportunity of denouncing the actions and opinions of Arnold to the Pope and the Curia. The proper course was forthwith taken. The proceedings of so pernicious a disturber of the public peace were condemned, himself warned to hold his tongue in future, and banished out of Italy under an oath not to return thither without an express papal permission. Arnold now betook himself again into France, and smarting with wounded pride and ambition, vindictively espoused the party of his old master Abelard, just then embroiled in his famous dispute with St. Bernard. For the Abbot of Clairvaux had found out that it would never do to allow that honest but mistaken man to go on spreading his views any longer unopposed, if the orthodox faith was to be preserved intact in Christendom. And so, after more than once privately warning him of his errors to no purpose, accepted a challenge which Abelard at last vauntingly sent him to a public disputation. This disputation came off at the Synod of Sens, A.D. 1140, and resulted in the total defeat of the philosopher by the monk. But Abelard appealed from the Synod to the Pope, whereupon the Synod suspended its farther measures, and advised the Holy See through St. Bernard of what had transpired. In doing so, the latter took care to expose the fatal consequences to revealed religion involved in Abelard's opinions, and in one of his letters on this subject stated the case thus: that, inasmuch as Abelard is prepared to explain everything by means of reason, he combats as well faith as reason. For what is so contrary to reason as to wish to go beyond the limits of reason by means of reason? And what more contrary to faith than to be unwilling to believe that which one is unable to reach by means of reason? Abelard fared no better at Rome than at Sens. His defeat was ratified by that authority from which there is no appeal. Moreover, he was commanded to desist from holding any more lectures, and all persons who should obstinately maintain his errors were excommunicated. Foremost among these was Arnold of Brescia, who scorned to imitate Abelard's submission to the authority of the Church, and blamed his penitential retreat at Cluny, where he shortly died an edifying death. St. Bernard, who had previously formed an ill opinion of Arnold from the reports which preceded him out of Italy, no sooner saw him at Sens actively interested for Abelard than he penetrated the entire duplicity of his character, at the same time that he felt fully alive to the damage which the victory just won over error might yet suffer from a man so able and resolute. Wherefore, as it was not his custom to serve the cause of truth by halves, the saint resolved to include the scholar with the master in his denunciation to the Pope, who at his instance ordered that Arnold too, as well as Abelard, should be incarcerated in a convent. But the crafty Italian managed to elude his doom by a timely flight, and after running many dangers by reason of the keen chase which St. Bernard gave him, found a safe retreat at Zurich. In that age, Zurich, by reason of the trade of Germany and Italy passing through it, was the most flourishing town of Switzerland. Trading communities are commonly as fond of novelty in opinion as in wares. Zurich verified this assertion in many ways, for owing to its free government, its proximity to the republics of Lombardy, and to the settlements of the Waldenses in the Alps, the place swarmed with that motley tribe of political and religious dreamers which liberty is ever doomed to tolerate in her train. Of course, Arnold had his clique among the rest. His reception by the citizens was enthusiastic. A public situation was given to him, and he resided in the city for the next 6 years. During that interval he confined his activity to Zurich and the cantons bordering it. In these he propagated his doctrines with success, and seems to have been forgotten by the public of France and Italy. No doubt he may be viewed as having helped to pave the way for Zwingli in the 16th and Strauss in the 19th, both of whom, like Arnold, spread the poison of their ideas from Zurich. In the meantime, events were transpiring at Rome which were destined to call Arnold from his retreat, and produce him again on the great stage of the world in a part more important than ever. These were the attempts of the Romans to restore their ancient republic on the ruins of the papal government. These attempts were not peculiar to the 12th century, but had been made in preceding ages, invariably to no other purpose than anarchy to the city, and scandal to the world. Indeed, there seems always to have been a party at Rome whose adherents, more pagan than Christian in their hearts, perversely mistook the destiny of the city, and far from viewing its new spiritual empire as nobler than its old material one, held the former as something meanly inferior to the latter, wholly blind to the fact that the Senate and emperors had been merely types of the hierarchy and the popes, and that in these, and not in those, God had decreed, from the time of Romulus himself, the true power and majesty of Rome should eventually reside. This party, then, who viewed the Pope as the Jews viewed our Saviour, whom they would not accept as their Messiah, but reviled him as an impostor because he possessed no worldly power, this party it was that, at the end of the 8th century, treated Leo III with such impious cruelty in their first recorded attempt to overthrow the papal government, that in the 10th century not only dethroned but imprisoned and murdered by the hands of the consul Crescentius, Benedict VI, and plunged the state into such disorders as to render necessary the bloody but just intervention of Otto III, Emperor of Germany, who delivered the Holy See from the oppression and indignities which overwhelmed it. About the middle of the 12th century, the example of the cities of Lombardy, roused to their struggle for freedom to a great degree by the eloquence of Arnold of Brescia, again awoke the republican faction at Rome, where other elements of lawlessness unhappily existed in the papal schism which then raged, and in which the anti-pope Anacletus drove from the Holy See Innocent II, the lawful pope. On the death of Anacletus and the return of Innocent, the sentence of the council, above mentioned, against Arnold of Brescia, still more embittered the revolutionary spirits of the city, worked up to wild enthusiasm by the temporary presence of that arch-demagogue on the spot to defend his cause. At last, the Pope's conduct to the citizens of Tivoli burst the storm of rebellion over his head. During the late schism, Tivoli had sided with Anacletus, and on his death still refused to acknowledge Innocent. A Roman army was accordingly marched out to reduce the place to obedience, but was defeated by a sudden sally of the besieged. A fresh army, which was shortly raised, behaved better, and Tivoli was reduced. Burning with shame at the disgraceful failure of their first attempt, the Romans clamoured for the total destruction of a hated rival and the dispersion of its inhabitants. But the Pope, satisfied with the triumph of his authority, would lend no countenance to so guilty a severity, and concluded with his chastised children a fatherly peace. For thus checking the bad passions of his subjects, he incurred their displeasure, whereupon the republican leaders, perceiving their opportunity, seized it at once, and by their virulent denunciations to the mob of the pretended tyranny of priests, soon stirred up an insurrection, and got the citizens to hold a congress in the Capitol, at which the papal government was declared at an end, and the ancient republic restored. Innocent strove to counteract this revolution, and called a synod at the Lateran, before which he protested against any right of the laity to interfere with his government, much less to alter it. But his efforts were vain, and he took his ill fortune so much to heart that he sickened and died of grief. Celestine II, his successor, had, as papal legate in France, formerly befriended Arnold of Brescia, a circumstance that could not fail to make him popular, and conduce to give effect to his efforts at conciliation, so that he completely succeeded in allaying the revolutionary storm during his short reign, which his death terminated in the spring of the following year. Under Lucius II, who was next elected to the papal throne, the public disorders burst forth again in an aggravated degree. Lucius deeply offended the Romans by seeking to secure himself against their fickle loyalty in an alliance with Roger, the Norman king of Sicily. In resentment of this proceeding, the newly elected Senate first caused the strongholds of the Frangipani and of other adherents of the papal party within the city to be demolished, and then sent an embassy to Conrad III of Germany to invite him to come and assume the imperial crown under their auspices, and act as countercheck to the king of Sicily. But Conrad, mistrusting the high-flown letter containing the invitation, and feeling, moreover, little sympathy with rebels against the Pope, declined it. Hereupon Lucius thought it the proper time to strike a blow towards recovering his authority. To this end he marshalled his cardinals and other dignitaries in all their pomp, put himself at their head, and, escorted by an armed array of lay partisans, set out for Rome with the intention of besieging the capital. At first the people, awed by so solemn and resolute an appearance of the Supreme Pontiff, showed signs of not helping, at least of not resisting, his attempt. But the agents of the Senate, actively at work among the crowd, succeeded in dissipating this fatal apathy, and in arousing in its stead so furious a spirit of hostility, that the result announced itself in a sacrilegious shower of stones, which rained cruelly on the heads of the priestly host, wholly scattering it, and hitting the Pope himself on the temples, who shortly died from the effects of the contusion. This catastrophe happened January 25th, 1145. The next day the dispersed cardinals came together again in St. Caesarius' church, and set the thorny tiara on the head of a stranger to their order. This was the abbot of the Cistercian convent of St. Anastasius in Rome, formerly a monk under St. Bernard at Clairvaux. He took the name of Eugenius III. He bore the reputation of a mild and conciliating man, which fact would probably weigh all the more with the conclave under existing circumstances, from the recollection of Celestine II, whose gentleness had tamed what it appeared sternness could not subdue. But Eugenius now showed that he was not wanting in one set of qualities, because it had hitherto served his purpose to display another. For, rather than recognize the new Senate, which the Republican party wished to make him do, he quitted the city overnight with all his suite, went through the ceremony of his installation at the convent of Forza, and then retired to Viterbo. Here he resided some months, and vainly endeavoured, through St. Bernard's agency, to induce the Emperor Conrad to arm in his behalf. At last, losing all patience at the lengths to which the Romans, encouraged by his absence, had begun to carry things, he levied at Tivoli and other well-affected places recruits in his service, took himself the command, and marched to attack his rebellious subjects. His expedition was crowned with success. The Republicans were humbled and sued for peace. This was granted to them on the condition that for the future the Pope should nominate the senators, that his prefect should be restored, and their patrician abolished. Eugenius then held his triumphant entry into Rome amid demonstrations of enthusiastic loyalty, and celebrated there the Christmas of 1145. But it was not long before the clouds of disaffection gathered again as blackly as ever, and discharged such a tempest on the refusal of Eugenius to give up Tivoli to the implacable hatred of the Romans, that he was forced to flee over the Tiber, amid a volley of darts and stones hurled after him by the mob. Such, in fact, were the straits to which the unfortunate pontiff was now reduced, that he at length found it expedient to pass into France. It was at this juncture, A.D. 1142, that Arnold of Brescia received an invitation from the Roman Senate, now wholly rid, as it would seem, of its great foe, to visit the Eternal City, and lend his aid in completing, as far as possible, the restoration of the old Republic. Such a golden opportunity of realizing the dearest dream of his ambition was irresistible. He accepted the invitation at once, and glowing with the thought of shortly reviving in his own person a Roman tribune of the ancient stamp, he crossed the Alps at the head of a fanatical rabble of Swiss, whom, under the hopes of sharing the glories of the expedition, he had seduced to follow him as a guard amidst its peril. At his passage through Lombardy, where his name was so popular, new bands joined his march. On reaching Rome, he and his men were received in triumph. The citizens, when they heard him and his speeches, set off by quotations from Livy and St. Paul, styled them Quirites, when they heard him give his florid descriptions of the greatness of the ancient republic, and launch his thunders of denunciation at the disgrace of priestly rule, set no bounds to their enthusiasm, but forthwith invested the orator with dictatorial powers. No sooner was this done than the indefatigable demagogue began his political reforms. These comprised, among the rest, laws for restoring the equestrian rank and the tribunes of the people, for more strictly excluding the Pope from all part in the government, and for reducing to the narrowest limits the prerogatives of the German emperors, as the first step toward shaking off their yoke entirely. At the end of 3 years, Pope Eugenius returned to Italy and addressed a letter from Brescia in July 1148 to the Roman clergy, warning them against proceedings of Arnold, whom he denounced as a schismatic, and as the main tool of the arch-enemy of mankind, calling on them to desist from abetting rebellion and to return under the obedience of their lawful superior, otherwise to incur excommunication. But neither this letter of Eugenius, nor 3 successive attempts made by him in the course of the next 4 years, at one time by negotiation, at another by arms, to enter his capital, availed his purpose. At last, a 4th attempt towards the end of 1152, by means of a treaty, under which he agreed to acknowledge the power of the Senate, succeeded. Nevertheless, he did not cease to suffer, during the short remainder of his reign, bitter mortifications from the insolence of the Senate and the dictator, Arnold of Brescia, who continued to reside in Rome in all his greatness, and shortly before the pontiff's death in 1153, aware of his repugnance to the republic, and alarmed at his growing favour with the people, defied him openly by increasing the number of the senators from 50 to 100, and by giving them as presidents 2 consuls after the ancient plan, instead of the patrician till then in use. It was for Eugenius III that his old preceptor, St. Bernard, composed, at his disciple's request, his famous book De Consideratione, in which the subject handled is on the duties of a pope, and in which is given such a graphic description of the degenerate character of the Romans, as also of the Roman clergy in that age. The following extract will not be out of place here. What is so well known to the world as the license and pride of the Romans? They are a people opposed to peace and ever given to sedition, wild and hard to deal with from all time, who only know how to obey when they can no longer resist, who possess understanding only that they may do evil by it, not to do good. Detested by heaven and earth, they have impiously outraged both. They are criminals before God, profaners of his sanctuary, rebels against themselves, enviers of their neighbours, monsters toward those who do not belong to them. They love no one and are beloved by no one. They strive after the show of being feared by all, while in fact they themselves fear everybody. They cannot endure any submission, but yet know not how to rule. They are false to their superiors and oppress their subjects. They are shameless in their demands and reject petitions with a haughty front. With blustering and impatience they press for presents, and are thankless when they have received them. They are great talkers with the tongue, but helpless creatures when it comes to act. They are spendthrifts in promises, niggards in the performance, the most crawling sycophants and the most venomous slanderers, who feign the most honest simplicity and are the most malicious of deceivers. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Pope Adrian IV, An Historical Sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Such were the depraved spirits, and such the ignoble tyranny which oppressed the Holy See on the demise of Eugenius III, an oppression which, if its violence seemed to slumber during the short career of Anastasius IV, whose patriarchal age and paternal goodness to the poor in a famine which desolated the country under his pontificate, commanded respect and won all hearts, yet woke up again with fresh vigor on the accession of his successor, the English Pope Adrian IV. Adrian, however, was as well by nature as by the experience of his past life a character not likely to be daunted by the threatening prospect before him, and behaved with such courage and decision as for the time to confound his rebellious subjects and reduce them to obedience. For when, on his assumption of the tiara, the Senate, which by this time seems to have arrived at the last pitch of insolence under the training of Arnold of Brescia, made a formal proposition to the new pope to renounce once for all his right to the government of the state, he no sooner heard it than he sternly rejected it, and drove the deputation through whom it came with ignominy out of his presence. Hereupon the mob, worked upon by the orators and other agents of the Republic, flew to arms, and led by Arnold of Brescia himself, who had been fetched out of the country on purpose, gave in to every disorder, and among other excesses murdered Cardinal Gerard, a well-known adherent of the Pope, as he was passing along the Via Sacra to an audience. Adrian declared this atrocity tantamount to high treason, and at once resolved to punish it by striking a blow such as till his time had not been struck at Rome at all. This was to lay the city under an interdict. No calamity in the Middle Ages was more dreaded, more cruelly felt by society than an interdict. This naturally arose out of that profound religious faith which in those times pervaded all classes of men alike in the midst of the greatest crimes and disorders. The interdict which Pope Adrian thus fulminated against Rome lasted from Palm Sunday till Maundy Thursday. It will not be uninteresting here to briefly describe an interdict. It was usually announced at midnight by the funeral toll of the church bells, whereupon the entire clergy might presently be seen issuing forth in silent procession by torchlight to put up a last prayer of deprecation before the altars for the guilty community. Then the consecrated bread that remained over was burnt. The crucifixes and other sacred images were veiled up. The relics of the saints carried down into the crypts. Every memento of holy cheerfulness and peace was withdrawn from view. Lastly, a papal legate ascended the steps of the high altar, arrayed in penitential vestment, and formally proclaimed the interdict. From that moment divine service ceased in all the churches. Their doors were locked up, and only in the bare porch might the priest, dressed in mourning, exhort his flock to repentance. Rites in their nature joyful, which could not be dispensed with, were invested in sorrowful attributes, so that baptism could only be administered in secret, and marriage celebrated before a tomb instead of an altar. The administration of confession and communion was forbidden. To the dying man alone might the viaticum, which the priest had first consecrated in the gloom and solitude of the morning dawn, be given. But extreme unction and burial in holy ground were denied him. Moreover, the interdict, as may naturally be supposed, seriously affected the worldly as well as religious cares of society, so that trade suffered, and even the proprieties of men's personal appearance fell into neglect. At first the Romans seemed as if they would not flinch under the novel and terrible blow dealt at them. But this was a passing bravado. They soon began to feel uneasy, and then horrified at the cessation of the divine offices and the refusal of the sacraments in Holy Week, a season of all others when the most lukewarm piety bestirs itself. The consequence was that they assembled tumultuously before the Capitol, where the Senate was sitting, and demanded that measures should directly be taken to bring about such an arrangement with the Pope as would relieve the city from the interdict. Negotiations were accordingly entered upon by that body with Adrian at Viterbo, whither he had retired to await the issue of events. To the overtures made, he answered that he was ready to come into them, provided the Senate would first banish Arnold of Brescia out of Rome, abolish the Republic, and together with the citizens return to their duty. After some hesitation, and some attempts to procure a modification of such sweeping terms, attempts which the inflexibility of the Pope entirely frustrated, those terms were accepted. On their completion, Adrian revoked the interdict, held his triumphant entry into Rome, and celebrated in the Church of St. John Lateran, with great pomp and jubilee, his coronation. In the meantime, Frederick Barbarossa, who had succeeded his uncle Conrad III on the German throne 2 years before, and had lately undertaken his first expedition into Italy to restore his fallen power in that country, and suppress its newly roused spirit of freedom, was advancing, flushed with his conquest of Tortona, and his coronation as King of Lombardy at Pavia, with his army towards Rome, where he proposed to give the last finish to his brilliant successes, by receiving the crown of empire from the Pope. Frederick and Adrian had both sent forward ambassadors to each other, who crossed on the road without knowing it. The king to treat about the imperial crown, the Pope to sound the intention of a visitor who was approaching in such warlike array. The papal envoys encountered Frederick at St. Quirico in Tuscany, and on being told that he meant nothing hostile to the rights of the Church, but on the contrary that he was ready to act as her champion, and therefore came simply to ask the imperial crown, they promised the Pope's acquiescence in his views, provided, among other services required of him, he would procure the delivery of Arnold of Brescia into the hands of justice. This was all the more insisted upon, as that indefatigable demagogue, having, after his banishment, obtained the protection of certain counts of the Campagna, still continued to exercise from his place of refuge the most pernicious influence over the popular mind in Rome. Frederick readily undertook to do a service which agreed as well with his personal feeling as with his policy, for Arnold of Brescia, on the election of the Duke of Swabia to the German throne, had written him a letter inviting him to come and receive the imperial crown from the Senate in contempt of the Pope, but couched in such arrogant and fanatical terms as highly to incense the king, who refused to listen to it. Whereupon Arnold aggravated his offence by announcing that he would persuade the Romans to choose an emperor of their own, and throw up their allegiance to foreign ones. The plan which Frederick took to seize Arnold was, first of all, to send a body of troops to waylay and capture one of the chiefs of the lawless counts of the Campagna, who had been mainly instrumental in liberating the arch-republican out of the hands of the papal officers, into which he had shortly fallen before at Auriculum, and then to threaten the speedy execution of the prisoner, unless Arnold were given up as a ransom. This plan succeeded. The other Campagnan counts, frightened at the resolute conduct of Frederick, and trembling at the consequences of his further anger, if the ransom demanded were not given, soon brought their client, whose revolutionary doctrines so much promoted those disorders by which they thrived, to the feet of the king, and received back their brother in exchange. Arnold was forthwith remanded in chains to Rome, there to await the arrival of Frederick, who intended to have the culprit tried before his own tribunal. But Peter, the prefect of Rome and commandant of the castle of St. Angelo, a devoted servant of the Pope, into whose custody Arnold was delivered, fearful lest his prisoner should escape by means of a popular riot, as he had done once before in the same circumstances, resolved to execute him on his own account, and without waiting for further instructions either from Frederick or Adrian, but secretly abetted by several cardinals on the spot, had the unhappy man led out early on the morning of the 18th of June, 1155, before the Popular or People's Gate, where he was fastened to a cross projecting from the midst of a pile of faggots, which, being fired, soon enveloped their victim in the flames. His cries and the tumult of the execution roused the citizens, dwelling hard by, from their beds, who presently ran up, lamenting and furious, to the rescue, but in vain, as they were thrust back on all sides by the soldiers who kept the ground. Nevertheless, such was the infatuated reverence which the people manifested for their late tribune, that it was found expedient after his execution to throw his ashes into the Tiber, to prevent them being enshrined as holy relics. Arnold of Brescia was about 50 years old when he thus met his fate. However shocking such cruel execution as he suffered may be to the more enlightened benevolence or more sensual refinement of the present day, yet from the point of view of the Middle Ages, that the visible punishment of a crime should be commensurate with, and as it were, symbolize its moral enormity, there can be no doubt but that, in the present case, the criminal received only what he deserved. Few men ever did worse mischief to society in their day than Arnold of Brescia. Private ambition was his ruling passion, and his hopes of gratifying it were set on the realization of dreams and fancies, engendered of an unbridled imagination, which an admixture of mysticism further distempered. A false scandal, which he took at the discrepancy between the lives and doctrines of the clergy, in his time widely corrupted, heightened by his pharisaical pride, which a bodily temperament naturally disinclined to sensual excess inflated all the more, as by means of such bodily temperament he was enabled, with so little merit of his own, to keep up an exterior severity of demeanour closely resembling a holy asceticism, led him at last to confound the abuse of religion with religion itself, and under the further influence of his insatiable thirst for notoriety, to broach schismatical views, and then a plan of ecclesiastical as well as political reform for the world, of which he persuaded himself he was marked out to be the apostle. That reform, as we have seen, was simply the return of society politically under the republican institutions of pagan Rome, and spiritually under the religious government of the apostolic ages. A fanatic of this description, endowed in an extraordinary manner with eloquence to announce his views, and with boldness and energy to pursue the career of carrying them out, as was Arnold of Brescia's case, may well be imagined to have seduced the multitude, at all times giddy, but in his day oppressed and shocked by many gross abuses, in the way he did, and so to have elicited the stern hostility of the constituted authorities in church and state, who naturally perceiving in the progress of such a man only confusion worse confounded, and ruin to the temporal and eternal interests of society, were in duty bound to eradicate the evil before it was too late, and in doing so not to shun harsh means where gentle ones failed, but, if words proved fruitless, to use the sword. The obstinacy, the infatuated obstinacy of Arnold of Brescia, in the face of so many warnings as from time to time were given to him, plainly proved that he was incorrigible, and that, therefore, as it was no more possible for society to prosper as it should do, while he continued to infect it with his wild theories, than for the bodily health to nourish while eaten into by a cancer, to extirpate him like it was the only course left. a course which thus became morally as much a duty in his case as it would physically become so in that. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. In the meantime, much had still to be negotiated between Frederick and Adrian before the latter felt satisfied to confer on the former the imperial crown. Adrian was too well acquainted with the character of Barbarossa not to feel it a paramount duty to require every guarantee before adding to the power and greatness of a man who, like him, thirsted for universal sway, under which not only the state, but the church also should bend, and who, in pursuit of his object, allowed no barrier, which he could throw down by fair means or by foul, to stand against him. Thus it was that although in his present transactions with the Pope he made plenty of fair promises, he yet would not pledge his word to them, lest by doing so he should commit his plans of future ambition, plans which, though he felt he should not hesitate to save, if driven to it at the cost of his honour, he yet would prefer to forward, if possible, without so mortifying an alternative. But when, after all his pains, he found out that the Pope was not to be drawn off his guard, and that the transcendent stake at issue was not to be won, except by confirming his word with an oath, he submitted to take it, and so swore on the Gospels and on the cross, before his own and the papal ambassadors in his camp near Viterbo, that he would neither injure the Pope nor his cardinals, but would protect their persons and rights against all aggression. Hereupon Adrian felt confidence enough to leave Nepi and repair to meet Frederick at Sutri, to which spot the latter had, in the meantime, advanced his camp. As Adrian drew near, he was encountered by a splendid deputation of German princes and bishops, who conducted him to the royal tent. As soon as the Pope appeared before it, Frederick, who was waiting to receive him, courteously advanced to assist his Holiness in dismounting from his horse, but did not offer to render the ancient homage, usual on such an occasion, of holding the Pope's stirrup. In vain did Adrian keep his seat in expectation that this homage would be paid. The king persisted in avoiding what his pride could not brook. Terrified at such a bad omen, the cardinals of the papal suite took to flight, and sought safety in the neighbouring fortress of Castellano, leaving their lord to confront alone the danger which seemed to threaten him. But Adrian retained his courage and coolness intact. Alighting from his horse, he quietly sat down in the episcopal chair which had been prepared for him, and suffered Frederick to approach and kiss his feet. But when the king rose up to receive the papal kiss of peace in return, Adrian refused it, and told him that he would not give it until the homage due from the temporal to the spiritual power had been paid in full. As Frederick denied, in vindication of his behaviour, the authenticity of the homage in question, a hot controversy ensued between the parties at issue, in which the king turned a deaf ear to every argument and example that was adduced to prove his error, seeking to evade their force, now by sophistical, now by threatening representations, until the Pope, disgusted at his disingenuous conduct, and tired out with a dispute which had lasted over the next day, to no purpose, cut it short by abruptly quitting the camp. Hereupon the king, perceiving that he must again offer sacrifice to his policy, suffered the prelates who surrounded him, and till this critical moment had so vainly sought to convince him of the justice of the Pope's cause, to overrule him, and then set out for Nepi, whither Adrian had returned. On his arrival, he no sooner beheld Adrian coming forth to meet him, than, advancing reverently on foot, he held the pontiff's stirrup, who, on touching the ground, directly enfolded the king in his arms, amid the cheers of the spectators of both parties. All these proceedings, and the latter one in particular, have been held up by many writers as setting in the strongest light the arrogance and tyranny of the Church in the Middle Ages. From our point of view at this day, for estimating the relative importance of Church and State, no doubt the result of the dispute between Adrian and Frederick was wrong, because it ought to have proved diametrically the reverse to be right. In the 12th century, however, the profound conviction of Christendom was this, that the Pope literally represented on earth, in the character of vicar or vice-regent, our Saviour in heaven, and as it may be taken for granted that were the Redeemer to reappear among men now as he appeared 1800 years ago, the proudest monarch of Christendom in the 19th century, persuaded of the fact, would, whether Catholic or Protestant, certainly not hesitate to show this honour to our divine Lord on receiving his visit. So the sovereigns of the Middle Ages did actually deem it right and honourable to pay that homage to Christ in the person of the Pope, in whom they acknowledged from the bottom of their souls our Lord's regent on earth, and as such their immeasurable superior. In requiring Frederick Barbarossa to pay him the typical homage of holding his stirrup, Adrian did plainly nothing but what was entirely in accordance with the spirit of the age, and at the same time with traditional usage as then received by Christian princes. But Frederick did do what was contrary to both in his refusal, and that, too, while professing to be imbued with the very faith out of which the homage in question sprang. Thus it is no wonder that Adrian should view such an inconsistency as most inauspicious for the liberties of the Church, with which those of society were then so closely bound up, and should therefore feel it imperative to pursue a line of conduct which at first glance may appear so arrogantly exacting, but which found, on closer examination, to have involved the assertion of the most sacred interests against a man who was known to respect none in promotion of his ends, assumes a character calculated rather to conciliate our approval than to confirm our censure. As soon as the friendly relations between the Pope and the King had been thus restored, they set out for Rome to celebrate the coronation. In the meantime, the Senate, though deeply offended at not having been consulted on so momentous an affair, sent forward an embassy to congratulate Frederick as he drew near. Thus it did in fulsome and arrogant terms, informing him, moreover, that the Queen of the World, as the city was styled by the orator, felt graciously disposed to confer on him, of her own good pleasure, the diadem of empire, if he, on his part, would promise to abolish the papal government, restore the ancient republic, and make a present of 5,000 silver crowns to the officers of the state. But Frederick no sooner perceived this drift of the speech, whose tone from the beginning had greatly irritated him, than he cut it short by an outburst of indignant sarcasm on men who, sunk to the lowest pitch of national degeneracy, yet thought to beard with the shadow of their past the substance of his present greatness, and to dictate terms to a prince who came not as their servant, but as their master. After having delivered himself further in the same caustic style, he asked them what answer they had to give, and on being informed that they could give none till they had reported their reception to the Senate, he haughtily bid them begone and do so. Aware that such conduct would highly incense the Romans, and very likely urge them to revenge it by throwing obstacles in the way of his coronation, Frederick consulted the Pope as to what had best be done, who advised him to send without delay a body of picked troops to occupy St. Peter's and the Leontine quarter of the city, in which that church stood, promising that the papal guards on the spot would support the movement. Frederick accordingly dispatched during the night 1,000 men on this service, which they successfully performed. The next morning, June 18th, 1155, by sunrise, he himself set out, preceded by the Pope, for the city, and passed into it by the Golden Gate, before which his whole army in compact and resplendent array drew up. At St. Peter's he was received by the Pope, who, surrounded by his cardinals and prelates, awaited the King's arrival on the steps of the great door. The pontifical high mass was then sung, and on its termination, Frederick, enthroned amidst the princes and dignitaries of the empire, was solemnly crowned emperor by the hands of the pope, the whole congregation bursting out, at so stirring and eventful a spectacle, into acclamations of joy and triumph. In the meantime, a squadron of imperial troops took possession of the bridge near the castle of Crescentius, now St. Angelo, over which the road into the heart of the town led, and by so doing shut out the ill-disposed citizens on the right bank of the Tiber from interrupting the ceremony. When all was over at St. Peter's, Frederick issued out of the church with the crown on his head, and mounting his horse, while his suite continued on foot, rode back through the Golden Gate to celebrate in his tent, erected against the city halls, the coronation banquet. As to Pope Adrian, he retired to his palace near St. Peter's. So far everything had turned out well. But a new scene was now to be acted, for as the emperor and his soldiers, divested of their armor on account of the great heat, were carousing under the cool shade of their tents in honor of the day, their toasts and songs were suddenly interrupted by the alarm that the Romans had risen and were advancing over the Tiber to attack the camp. The truth was that the Senate and citizens, exasperated beyond measure at Frederick's treatment of their ambassadors, and at his superior generalship in occupying the city and effecting his coronation in their teeth, had met at the Capitol while he was at St. Peter's, and passed the resolution not to let so mortifying a day pass over without striking a blow in revenge. Wherefore, as soon as the coronation was finished, and the scene clear, the furious populace burst over the Tiber, and after first butchering what few German soldiers still lingered imprudently at St. Peter's, rushed on to the grand attack. Frederick no sooner heard this unwelcome news than he started from table, gave the word to arm, and sallied out to encounter the enemy. The battle that ensued was maintained on both sides with unflinching courage and varied fortunes. Now the Romans drove the Germans beyond their lines. Now the Germans pursued the Romans into the heart of the city. Such was the hatred which each party felt against the other, that not only the men but the women joined in the struggle. When it had thus lasted till sunset, victory declared for the Germans. The Romans fled on all sides, with a loss of more than 1,000 killed or drowned, and 200 captured. The emperor, as Otto of Friesingen asserts, had the extraordinary good fortune to lose in such an obstinate and bitter combat only 2 men, 1 killed and 1 made prisoner. "Such," cried Frederick, as he beheld the defeat of the enemy and recollected the terms of the Senate the day before, "such, O Rome, is the price which thy prince pays for thy crown, such the way in which we Germans buy our empire." On the morrow he turned over his prisoners to Peter, the prefect of Rome, who executed some, as notorious ringleaders, on the spot, and allowed others to ransom themselves at exorbitant rates. Indeed, that stern functionary would have put the whole of them to death, had not Adrian, in whose breast this unfortunate outbreak had produced the liveliest regret, interfered in their behalf, so that it was reluctantly resolved to set them free. Notwithstanding his victory, as no market for provisions could be opened for his army by reason of the animosity of the Roman peasantry, Frederick was obliged to raise his camp and seek a more friendly and fruitful neighborhood, where the soldiers might enjoy repose after so trying a campaign. The spot he removed to was near Tivoli. Here he halted for several days, and received a visit in his quarters from Pope Adrian, who kept with the emperor the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. Both sovereigns appeared at high mass on this occasion, wearing their insignia of state. After the service, Adrian solemnly absolved the emperor's troops from all guilt which the slaughter they had made of the Romans in the late conflict might appear to lay them under, the maxim adopted being that he who fights out of obedience to his prince against the enemy of the state must not be deemed a murderer but an avenger. And yet Frederick did not hesitate to seize an opportunity which now offered of breaking his oaths, and of repaying the Pope's good offices by invading his rights. For on the citizens of Tivoli offering him, at his secret instigation, the sovereignty of their city, which belonged to the Holy See, he accepted it, and only on Adrian's determined opposition to such an usurpation affected to restore it with reservation of his imperial prerogatives over the place, prerogatives which he could not define, and which meant, in fact, nothing more than the renewal of his aggression at the next more favourable opportunity. For now the complaints of his army, worn out by fatigue, exposed, moreover, to every vexation through the ever-increasing animosity of the Italians, and hence doubly impatient to return into Germany, from which it had been absent much longer than the terms of feudal service required, obliged Frederick to think of finishing his campaign and marching home directly, if he did not mean to be left alone in the heart of a hostile country, a predicament into which the desertion of his men was already beginning to betray him. He accordingly took the road back into Germany, soon after he had made restitution to the Pope as above described, and after running many perils in his progress through regions so justly hostile to him, regained his own states beyond the Alps, not so much gratified by the acquisition of the imperial crown, as embittered by what he had gone through in pursuit of it, and resolved not to delay longer than he could help a second invasion of Italy, which should compensate the mishaps and mortifications of the first. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Pope Adrian IV, an Historical Sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. While Frederick was yet fighting his way home through Italy, Adrian came to face about and confront another foe in William, the Norman King of Sicily. William had lately succeeded his father Roger, a wise and able monarch, to whom, however, his son, as so commonly happens, bore no sort of resemblance. But by his incapacity and total subjection under the influence of a profligate favourite of low birth, named Reggio, soon threw the state, which Roger had left in so prosperous a condition, into the worst disorder. The breach between him and the Pope arose out of a letter which the latter had occasion to address to the king at Salerno, in which the royal title was omitted, and that of mere lord substituted. Adrian did this because William had assumed the crown of Sicily without first asking it of the Pope, who, as the feudal patron of that island by ancient compact with its Norman conquerors under Robert de Guiscard in the time of Pope Leo IX, A.D. 1053, justly felt his rights infringed by a proceeding which set at naught their established forms. In revenge of this pretended insult, William refused to negotiate with the ambassadors through whom it came, and furthermore gave orders to his chancellor Scitinius, whom he had just made viceroy of Apulia, to attack the domain of the church, which that officer accordingly did by laying siege to Beneventum and devastating its territory. But as this proceeding caused a number of disaffected crown vassals of Apulia, already secretly tampered with by agents of the Greek emperor, anxious to recover his lost sway in Italy, to revolt against the Sicilian government, many of whom in so doing marched to the relief of Beneventum, Scitinius was soon obliged to raise the siege of that city, and turn his arms against some more vulnerable point. To this end he passed direct into the Campagna, and there set fire to the towns of Caparano, Barbuco, and Todi, after which he made his retreat, demolishing by the way the walls of Aquino, and driving a crowd of monks out of their convents, which he gave up to the plunder of the soldiers. These events had transpired while Frederick Barbarossa was yet advancing towards Rome to demand the imperial crown, and on his arrival formed one of the heads of complaint to him on the part of the Pope, who hoped to use the strong arm of the professed champion of the Church in redressing her wrongs. Frederick, indeed, expressed the warmest zeal in the Pope's cause, and none the less so as it presented, under the appearance of a sacred duty, a prospect so inviting to his own ambition. But, as we have seen, he was reluctantly compelled by his murmuring soldiers to close his campaign and return home. He did not, however, lose sight of Sicily, which, as will be described in the sequel, gave rise to a fresh and sharper quarrel between him and the Pope. Disappointed in his hopes of assistance from Frederick, Adrian, with characteristic energy, resolved to assist himself, and rejoined to the ruffianism of William with a ban of excommunication, a proceeding which instantly decided in the Pope's cause several of the most powerful nobles of Apulia, especially Robert, Count of Loritelli, the king's cousin, Andrew, Count of Rupi, Canino, Richard, Count of Aquila, and Robert, Prince of Capua, men who, like the bulk of their order, were impatient to shake off the oppressive and ignominious yoke of the royal favourite Rajo. Backed by these, who again were secretly encouraged by the court of Constantinople, Adrian followed up his ban of excommunication by invading at the head of his troops the Terra di Lavoro, which he totally subdued, and then proceeded to Beneventum, where he fixed his headquarters. William, who in the meantime was in Sicily and lulled asleep to every interest under the noxious influence of Reggio, no sooner became aware of his bad fortune across the water, where, owing to the events just related, all his Italian possessions, with the exception of Naples, Amalfi, Sorrento, and a few other towns and castles of secondary importance, were wrested from him, than he presently shook off his lethargy, sailed over to Salerno, and from that city sent ambassadors to the Pope to negotiate a peace. To this step he was urged all the more by finding out that Emmanuel, the Greek emperor, after refusing to stand his ally at the beginning of the war, was in correspondence, through his minister Palaeologus, with Adrian, trying to procure from the latter the cession of 3 seaports of Apulia in consideration of a large sum of money, and of the promise to expel the Sicilian king from his Italian dominions. The offers which William made were, namely, to pay a sum equivalent to that rendered by Emmanuel, to surrender the 3 seaports in question as an indemnification for the damage done by Scitinius, and to swear fealty to the Pope as the liege lord of Sicily. At first Adrian doubted if these terms were genuine, and sent a cardinal to Salerno to learn the truth. On being advised that all was straightforward, he declared his readiness to accept them. But a cabal in the German interest among the cardinals now put in such a strong opposition to the Pope's intention, that, taken by surprise, he dropped it, and retracted his favourable answer to William. The truth was, a reconciliation between Adrian and William would have seriously embarrassed Frederick Barbarossa's designs on Sicily, to say nothing of the protection which such an event would secure to the Pope against those farther aggressions on the Church which the Emperor had in view. Driven to desperation by the final decision of the Pope, William, who, with all his faults, seems still to have been capable of a rash energy when real danger stared him in the face, resolved to throw himself again on the chance of war. Collecting a formidable armament by sea and land, he invested Brundusium, which, with the exception of the citadel, had fallen into the hands of Michael Ducas, the Greek general. The citadel, which could not be subdued by arms, was obliged at last to yield to famine, when, in the moment that the garrison was about to close with the terms of surrender proposed by the enemy, William came up with his army, and obliged the Greek commander, instead of taking possession of the citadel, to face about and fight a pitched battle for the town. The struggle was obstinate and bloody. Fortune often changed sides, but at last declared for the Sicilians, into whose hands Ducas himself fell. The recovery of Brundusium, which followed this victory, seasonably placed at William's disposal a number of rich Greek captives, whom he sent to Palermo, much ready money and precious property, besides ships and stores. A crowd of Apulian malcontents had also the misfortune to fall into his power, on whom he did not fail to wreak his vengeance, by executing some, blinding and maiming others, and selling the rest into slavery. Flushed with this success, he next marched to Bari. Here he met with no resistance, but on the contrary an affecting appeal to his mercy in the spectacle of the citizens coming out before him, dressed in sackcloth, in token of submission. So solemn a humiliation, however, could not atone in the king's eye for their crime in having demolished the citadel of the town, because it refused to turn disloyal when the rebellion first broke out. To their entreaties for pardon he sternly replied that he should deal out strict justice to them, that as they had not spared his house, he should not spare their houses. A respite of 2 days only was allowed them, in which to quit their homes with their goods. Upon its expiration, the entire city, with its walls, was reduced to a heap of ruins. Struck with terror at so cruel a vengeance, the rest of the revolted Apulian towns hastened to send in their submission, whereupon William turned his arms at once against Beneventum, where not only the Pope, but also Prince Robert of Capua, and several other leaders of the rebellion resided. As the king approached, the Prince of Capua, seized with terror, fled, but with so little caution as to fall into an ambush set for him by his vassal and fellow rebel, Richard, Count of Fondi, who took the prince, his son, and daughter prisoners, and delivered them to his sovereign, by which piece of seasonable perfidy Richard atoned for his treason and recovered the royal favour. As to Robert, he was shipped off to Palermo, thrown into a dungeon, where his eyes were put out. In this sad condition, however, he did not long survive, as the severity of his treatment soon brought death to his relief. With such melancholy proofs of the mutability of worldly fortune before his eyes, and viewing, moreover, the success of his enemy as a sign of the divine disapprobation of his having been so weak as to refuse terms of peace against his better judgment, Adrian now resolved to lose no time in doing what was yet in his power towards repairing his error, and began by successfully requesting the Sicilian king to give up farther pursuit of his vengeance against the rest of the rebel chiefs still shut up in Beneventum, and to pardon them on condition of their quitting the kingdom. He next offered to close with those terms of peace, the rejection of which had caused the present war, and sent ambassadors to the king on the subject. William received them respectfully, and opened negotiations with them. The Pope, on his part, engaged to invest the king in fief with the kingdom of Sicily, the duchy of Apulia, the principality of Capua, Naples, Salerno, and Malfi, with the March, and with all that he claimed on his side the Marsa. The king, in return, engaged to swear fealty to the Pope, to defend him against his enemies, and to pay him a fixed yearly tribute for Apulia, Calabria, and the March. These formed the principal articles of the treaty now agreed to. But there were others included, in which the king took advantage of his position as conqueror to exact terms in favour of the secular, and to the detriment of the spiritual power in his states. By these terms, the royal right to confirm canonical elections was extended, appeals to Rome from Apulia were restricted, while in Sicily they were wholly abolished, as well as the right to send legates into the island. This peace was signed in the church of St. Marcianus, near Beneventum, where, in the presence of a splendid array of nobles and of a vast crowd of people, the king of Sicily prostrated himself in homage at the feet of the Pope, who then embraced his august vassal and invested him with fiefs of Sicily, Apulia, and Capua, by presenting him with 3 standards representing those states. After all was over, the king made rich presents of plate and precious garments to the cardinals in the suite of the Pope, of whom he then took leave and returned to Palermo. Shortly afterwards, Adrian published a bull, in which the peace was confirmed. On his way from Beneventum to Rome, he visited Orvieto, a city which had for a long time stood in open rebellion against him as its prince, but had recently returned to its duty. Here he stayed some time, and received the most loyal demonstrations from the citizens, on whom he conferred many tokens of his paternal regard. From Orvieto he proceeded to Viterbo for the winter, and then repaired to Rome. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Soon after his accession, Adrian received, among other letters of congratulation, one from Henry II, King of England, who had succeeded to his crown at the same time as the Pope. This letter was as follows. A sweet breath of air hath breathed in our ears, inasmuch as we learn that the news of your elevation hath scattered like a refulgent aurora the darkness of the desolation of the Church. The Apostolic See rejoiceth in having obtained such a consolation of her widowhood. All the churches rejoice at beholding the new light arise, and hope to behold it expand to broad day. But in particular our West rejoiceth that a new light hath arisen to illuminate the globe of the earth, and that, by divine favour, the West hath restored that sun of Christianity which towards the East was set. Wherefore, most holy Father, we, sharing in the general jubilee at your honours, and celebrating with devout praise the bounties of the divine majesty, will lay open to you our desires, confiding as we do with filial devotion in your paternal goodness. For if the carnal son exposeth to his father in confidence his carnal desires, how much more should not the spiritual son do so with regard to his spiritual one? Assuredly, among other desires of our heart, we do not a little desire that, as the Almighty's right arm hath chosen your most reverend person to be spiritually planted, like a tree of life, in the midst of paradise, and to be transplanted from this land of ours into his orchard, we will chiefly take care to reform, by your conduct and doctrine, all the churches, that all generations may call your land blessed through your beatitude. This, too, we thirst for with a sincere heart, that the spirit of tempest, which is wont to rage furiously about the pinnacle of honour, may never wrest you from the concern of your sanctification, lest, by reason of any deficiency in you, the deepest abyss of disgrace should succeed to the highest summit of dignity. And this we ardently long for, that, as the regulation of the Church Universal belongs to you, you will take care to create such cardinals, free of reproach, as shall know how to appreciate your burden, and be willing and competent to aid you in supporting it, not regarding ties of country, quality of birth, or extent of power, but that they love God, hate avarice, thirst after justice, and burn with the zeal of souls. Nor are we slightly affected by the desire that, as the unworthiness of ministers is detrimental above all things to the Church, you will vigilantly watch, whenever your providence shall happen to be petitioned, touching the collation of benefices, lest any unworthy person intrude into the patrimony of the crucified. And seeing that the Holy Land, blessed by the origin of our redemption, consecrated by the life and death of Christ, a land which Christian devotion holds in particular respect, is distracted by incursion of the infidels and polluted by their abominations, we wish from our very soul that you would provide men of your own devout solicitude in its defense. And in regard of that empire of Constantinople, once so illustrious, now so woefully desolate, what Christian man ought not to desire that by your care and prudence it may receive timely consolation? For the rest, we confide and hope in the Lord, that as you have not failed, while rising from virtue to virtue, and from honor to honor, to shine according to the exigence of each of them, so you will not fail, now that you are called to the apogee of apostolical elevation, to illustrate and inflame the subject church in such a manner as shall permit no one to hide himself from your light and heat, and that after your death you will leave behind such vestiges of sanctity that your native land, which congratulates itself on your happy beginning, will find much glory in the Lord in your happier end. Finally, we request of your paternity with full confidence that you will be pleased to remember us, our family and kingdom, especially in your prayers and vows. A few months after the receipt of this letter, Adrian was visited by his renowned countryman, John of Salisbury, afterwards Bishop of Chartres, who arrived in a diplomatic capacity from King Henry to procure the papal sanction to a projected conquest of Ireland by England. The motives to this ambitious scheme, which William the Conqueror and Henry I had also entertained, were alleged to be the civilization of the Irish people and the reformation of the Irish Church, both of which were represented as given over to barbaric anarchy and the most crying abuses. And indeed, such was the real state of civil and religious affairs in that country in the 12th century, as will be shown lower down, that the motives in question derived the greatest weight from the circumstance and induced the Pope to give the sanction requested. This he did in the following brief. Adrian, Bishop, servant of the servants of God, to his most dear Son in Christ, the illustrious King of the English, health and apostolical benediction. Thy magnificence thinketh praiseworthy and fruitfully touching the propagation of thy glorious name over the earth, and the laying up of a reward of eternal felicity in heaven, when, like a Catholic prince, thou dost project the extension of the boundaries of the Church, the proclamation of the Christian faith to ignorant and rude people, and the extirpation of the weeds of vice from the Lord's vineyard, and when, to the better execution hereof, thou dost request the advice and favor of the Apostolic See. In which matter we feel confident that, as thou shalt proceed with higher counsel and greater discretion, so thou wilt make under the Lord's favor the happier progress, seeing that those things usually reach a good issue which have sprung out of an ardor for the faith and love of religion. Certainly there can be no doubt that Ireland, as well as all the isles, which Christ the Sun of Justice hath illuminated, and which have borne testimony to the Christian faith, are subject to St. Peter and the most holy Roman Church, on which account we are all the more ready to plant therein the plantation of the faith and the seed which is grateful to God, as we discover on close examination it is required of us. Forasmuch then as thou hast signified to us, most clear Son in Christ, that thou art wishful to enter the island of Ireland, to subdue that people under the laws, and to root out of it the weeds of vice, and art wishful to pay to St. Peter a pension of 1 penny a year for each house, and to preserve intact the rights of the Church in that country, we, regarding favorably and vouchsafing to thy petition our gracious assent, hold it to be a grateful and acceptable thing that thou shouldst enter that island, to extend the boundaries of the Church, to stem the torrent of crime, to correct morals, to introduce virtue, to augment the Christian religion, and to execute what thy mind may have found good for God's honor and the country's prosperity. And let the people thereof receive thee honorably and respect thee as their Lord, the rights of the Church remaining intact, and saving the pension to St. Peter and the most holy Roman Church of 1 penny a year for each house. And shouldst thou be so fortunate as to accomplish what thou hast planned, strive to improve the Irish nation by good morals, and act in such a manner by thyself, as well as by those whom thou shalt employ, and whom thou shalt first have proved to be trustworthy by means of their fidelity, their opinions, and conduct, that the Church may be adorned, the Christian faith extended, and everything that belongs to the honour of God and salvation of souls so ordered by thee in Ireland as to qualify thee to deserve an eternal reward in heaven and a glorious name on earth through all ages. This famous brief, by which Henry II of England held himself divinely authorized to conquer Ireland, is strongly disapproved of by many writers, especially by Irish ones, who will not alloy it the least excuse, but overwhelm it with abusive censure. And yet the plain truth is, Adrian meant it, as he worded it, for Ireland's good. However false the grant of Constantine the Great, on which the claim set up for St. Peter's dominion over the islands is founded, may have been proved in later times to be, yet it is certain that both the grant and claim in question were in the 11th and 12th centuries firmly believed in by all Orthodox Christians, just as much so as that the Pope was literally our Saviour's vicar on earth, before whose powers every other had to bow. That the King of England was secretly guided by worldly motives, while ostensibly professing religious ones, was his concern and not the Pope's, whose business was to weigh the merits of the case, not by reasons imputed, but by those propounded, which, if he found them from the religious point of view of his time sound, he was justified in accepting. Now, there is the best evidence in contemporary writings, especially in those of Giraldus and St. Bernard, that Ireland was, as above said, given up in the 12th century to the worst demoralization in church and state that a country, not wholly pagan or savage, could be. Giraldus, who travelled in Ireland in the suite of King John, and attentively observed its condition, expresses in his work written on the subject his surprise that a nation in which the Christian faith had been planted so far back as the days of St. Patrick, and had gone on increasing more or less ever since, should yet in his age be so ignorant in the very rudiments of religion. A nation, as he proceeds to describe it, filthy in the extreme, buried in vice, and of all nations the most ignorant of the rudiments of the faith. In support of this severe censure, he accuses the Irish of despising matrimony, of being addicted to incest, of refusing to pay tithes, and of totally neglecting attendance at church. In another place he writes that the people in many districts continued still to be pagans, through the indifference of the clergy. St. Bernard draws a picture not less darkly shaded. In his life of St. Malachi, adverting to the state of the Irish Church on the promotion of that saint to the episcopacy, he describes how the new bishop soon found out that he had to do with brutes and not with men, how that nowhere he had met with such barbarism of every sort, nowhere found a race so perverse in their morals, so savagely opposed to religious rites, so impious towards the faith, so headstrong against discipline, so barbarous towards the laws, so filthy in their habits of life. A people, Christians in name, but heathens in practice, who paid no tithes, who contracted no lawful marriages, who never confessed their sins, who had hardly anyone among them to ask or give a penance, in whose churches neither the voice of the preacher nor the chorus of the chanters was ever heard. The political was in complete harmony with the religious state of the country. Parcelled out among petty kings and chiefs, who seemed only to subsist by devouring each other, and in the crush and tumult of their feuds, stood so thick on the ground as hardly to have elbow room, the whole island presented one untiring round of treacheries, massacres, conflagrations, and plunderings, wholesale and retail, such as is without example elsewhere in history, with no other hope, so long as left to itself, of anything but an aggravation of the evil, if that were possible. That Adrian, with such a state of things before his eyes, should readily give his sanction to a project which, however liable to be clogged by human imperfection, could not at any rate make things worse, but haply might make them better, was surely a proceeding quite consistent with the character of a wise and zealous pope. Of a pope, too, who lived and thought when the Crusades were at their height, and who may, therefore, be very well supposed to have viewed the condition of Ireland, once the island of saints, but now the scene of worse than pagan abominations, as not less calculated for the efforts of holy chivalry than Palestine. If, then, it can appear that Adrian might have acted in his brief to Henry just as well out of motives of religious duty as out of those of court policy, it is a perverse thing to award him the latter rather than the former, because to do so is to make him not less absurdly than wickedly inconsistent with his previous and subsequent career, which was marked by one unswerving purpose to defend the Church against the encroachment of secular power, to maintain her doctrines intact, and to extend her boundaries to the utmost. Besides, it should not be forgotten that his brief was confirmed by his illustrious successor, Alexander III, who thus gave his testimony to the uprightness of intention which originated it, as well as to its proper adaptation, in the spirit of that age, to the emergency which elicited it. An emergency which, from the terms used by Alexander in conveying his confirmation, would seem by no means to have diminished, but rather to have increased in the meantime. In short, it is nothing better than a logical solecism to wish to maintain that two such popes as Adrian IV and Alexander III, educated in the school of the sublime Hildebrand, and ranking among the very foremost of his disciples by the intelligent and dauntless manner in which they withstood the storm of imperial usurpation, which threatened to shatter the Church under their pontificates, should deviate from their glorious career to belie their principles, the one by granting out of national prejudice and court sycophancy a license of spoliation to a king of England, and the other by confirming it out of reasons just as unworthy. As it was, Providence did not see fit to allow the views either of Adrian or Henry to be carried out as originally intended, for the expedition of the king against Ireland was put off, on account of various obstacles, for 14 years, during which term the papal brief was consigned to the royal archives, and there forgotten. Nor was it till 6 years after the actual invasion of Ireland by Strongbow that its existence was remembered by Henry, who, anxious to consolidate his new conquest, had the authority of Adrian's brief renewed, by procuring another in confirmation of it from Alexander, and then caused such documents to be read up before the Irish bishops, assembled in synod at Waterford, by whom his sovereignty had already, without any reference to papal commands, been acknowledged. That the English sway turned out so unjust and disastrous to Ireland reflects no blame on Adrian, than whom no one would have more deplored the evil, and striven against its true causes, than he. Rather ought he, from the spirit of his brief, the only fair test to apply to him, to be regarded as the head of that small, unfortunately so very small, band of Englishmen who have ever meant well to the sister isle, and who, to speak the sober truth, if their views might prevail, would alone be likely to promote her true prosperity, by shielding her not only against her outward but her inward foes, to which latter, consisting in those elements of social discord so profusely, so deeply rooted, as it would seem, in the nature of her people, she owes by far the worst portion of her calamities. No doubt Pope Adrian, a man of the most shrewd practical intellect, and, from the circumstances of his life, of the deepest experience in human nature, saw clearly enough then, what continues to be seen so clearly by men of his stamp now, that Ireland could never truly prosper so long as left to her own management, by reason of the incurable defect mentioned above. and that, therefore, to sanction her sisterly, not her slavish connection with a nation like the English, so eminent for those very qualities of order and self-maintenance in which she is so wanting, would be a work of as great charity in itself as of mutual advantage to the parties concerned. For the rest, it should not be forgotten that however much the English occupation of Ireland may, through a series of causes not to be foreseen in Adrian's time, have turned out a curse, yet the occupation in question had the immediate effect of producing the reform of those religious abuses which constituted the worst misfortunes of the country, and which, till Henry had actually arrived thither, continued in all their hideous deformity. This happy result took place under the auspices of Henry at the Synod of Cashel, summoned by him at the beginning of the year 1172, and attended by all the heads of the Irish clergy. Besides the brief in question, Adrian gave to John of Salisbury, as the latter relates in the last chapter of his Metalogicus, a gold ring set with a fine emerald for the king his master, in token of investment with the lordship of Ireland; which important jewel, whose rare virtues John of Salisbury adds, were he to describe it, would require a volume to enumerate, was also deposited in the royal archives. Not only Henry II. Of England, but Louis VII. Of France, a year or two later, solicited Adrian's approbation of a scheme of foreign conquest, which in this case was intended to be carried out in Spain, where the French monarch pretended he wanted to serve the Church by expelling the Saracens. But the Pope treated the application of Louis very differently to that of Henry, for in his brief of reply, after awarding all praise to the religious zeal alleged by the French king as his motive, he points out the flagrant wrong which Louis would commit in gratuitously interfering in the affairs of an independent nation like Spain, the consent of whose princes could alone justify such a step. So that, until such consent could be obtained, he, Adrian, could do nothing else than totally condemn and warn him against his project. Adrian's conduct in this instance was not less consistent than in the other, for as over Ireland in his character of an island he believed himself to possess through the supposed testament of Constantine certain rights, and thought proper to exercise them, so over Spain, being ignorant of any such rights, he arrogated none, but acted as became him on the general principles of Christian justice. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. It was most likely on occasion of this embassy that John of Salisbury, although he mentions other visits paid by him to Adrian, held the interesting conversation with the English Pope which he reports at length in his Polycratius. In that work he says he well remembers how, during a sojourn at the papal court in Beneventum, he was treated on the most familiar footing by his Holiness, whose habit it was to gather round him a few select friends, with whom he would freely discuss a variety of topics, and how, among others, he once asked John to state candidly what he knew of the people's opinion touching the Roman Church and her head. Whereupon the envoy of Henry, using the liberty of the Spirit, told without disguise all that he had heard in various parts on the subject. For example, that the Roman Church, the mother of all others, showed herself, according to many, not so much a mother as a stepmother to her daughters; that scribes and Pharisees sat in her, who loaded other men's shoulders with burdens, which they would not touch even with their fingers; that these said scribes and Pharisees played the tyrant over the clergy, and bore no palpable resemblance to such shepherds as tread the true path of life, but that they heaped up rich furniture, ornamented their tables with gold and silver plate, distracted the Church with controversies, and by setting the pastors and the people by the ears; that they in no manner commiserated the sorrows of the unfortunate, but made merry over the plunder of churches, and administered justice not according to the truth, but the price. Then that other people said the Roman pontiff himself was a tyrant, and that, while the churches which their ancestors had built were falling to ruin, and the altars stood desolate, he appeared abroad arrayed in gold and purple. But that the divine wrath would eventually overtake such priests as lived in pride and luxury, and levied taxes on the provinces like men who meant to equal the wealth of Croesus. For the Lord had said, that as they measured out to others, so would he measure out to them, and the Ancient of Days could not lie. Upon hearing this and much more to the same effect, the Pope asked John of Salisbury what he himself thought, who replied that the question very much perplexed him, as on the one hand he feared to pass for a flatterer if he went contrary to public opinion, and on the other to give offence if he spoke the truth. Nevertheless, as Cardinal Guido Clement had bore witness in favour of the people, he, John of Salisbury, dared not contradict him. For the cardinal had said that the Church of Rome contained a world of avarice and deceit from which every evil sprung. This he had not said in a corner, but before all his brethren, in presence of Pope Eugenius, and that he, John of Salisbury, would not hesitate to declare that, as far as his experience went, he had never seen anywhere clergymen of greater virtue or more opposed to avarice than those of Rome. Such was the gravity and modesty of many of them, that in those respects they equalled Fabricius, while in possessing the true faith they had the advantage over him. Then, with regard to the Pope himself, as His Holiness insisted on being plainly spoken to, he would say that inasmuch as the Holy Ghost could not err, so whatever His Holiness might teach must be followed, though what His Holiness might do was not always to be imitated. His Holiness was styled Father and Lord of all. But why, if he was the Father, did he require presents from his children? And why, if he was the Lord, did he not strike awe into the Romans, curb their insolence, and reclaim them to their duty? At all this the Pope laughed heartily, and expressed himself well pleased at having found a man so honest and plain spoken, adding that if ever he should hear anything further to the same purpose, by no means to omit reporting it. Adrian then proceeded to pass his own conduct in review, said many things for and against himself, and made reflections on the arduousness of the papal office, affirming that no other was so full of cares, and that no man was more wretched than a Roman pontiff. For his throne was set with thorns, his mantle pierced with sharp points, and so heavy as to weigh the strongest shoulders to the ground. Much sooner would he prefer never to have left his native English soil, or to have remained forever hidden in his cell at St. Rums, than to have entered such straits. But the divine dispensation had called him, and he dared not disobey. He further said that it had always been the Lord's pleasure that he should grow between the hammer and the anvil, that now he prayed the Lord would be pleased to put his hand under the burden, as it was become insupportable. The Pope then concluded his observations by relating to the company the fable of the belly and the members, which the charges laid at his door suggested to him, and which John of Salisbury gives at length in Adrian's words. A fable, by the way, which assuredly has lost none of its point since those times, but remains as pregnant with wisdom for the 19th as for the 12th century. Pope Anastasius IV had conferred on the Knights Hospitaliers of Jerusalem the privilege of exemption from tithes on their property, in consideration of its exclusive destination to the relief of pilgrims and of the poor. This privilege soon gave rise to a quarrel between the knights and the clergy of Jerusalem, who naturally took it ill that so important a source of revenue as the tithes on the possession of the Order of St. John, no doubt constituted, should thus be stopped. The Patriarch reproached the Grand Master with abusing his privilege, and at last grew so embittered that he drew up a charge against him, of acts of aggression on the rights of the Oriental Church. For example, that the Hospitallers allowed all such persons to attend their church as were excommunicated by the bishops, and did not even refuse such outcasts the Holy Sacrament and extreme unction when dying, as well as Christian burial when dead. That when, for some great crime, silence was imposed on the churches of a town or district, the knights were always the first to ring their bells and call the people, on whom the interdict was laid, to Mass, for no other purpose than to get the offerings and fees which otherwise would accrue to the parish church. That the priests of St. John did not, on their ordination, present themselves according to ancient custom before the bishop of the diocese, to ask his permission to do duty therein. That the bishop was never advised of the lawful or unlawful suspension of a priest. Lastly, that the Knights of St. John absolutely refused to pay tithes on their property. From these general charges the Patriarch next descended to particular ones of affronts to himself. For instance, that, as the Hospital of St. John stood opposite the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Knights had erected their buildings on a scale of magnificence superior to the latter church, purely out of a feeling to insult the Patriarch. Moreover, that when the Patriarch ascended according to traditional usage the place of our Saviour's Passion to absolve the people from their sins and preach to them, the Hospitallers invariably set out their bells a-ringing with such violence as plainly proved that they meant to drown his voice and interrupt him in the performance of his duty. That when he had often complained to the citizens of this misconduct, and these had expostulated with the perpetrators, the latter only replied that they would yet play him worse turns; that they had, in fact, kept their word, for they had shot arrows at him in the church itself, while celebrating there the divine offices. These arrows he, the Patriarch, had caused to be picked up and exposed in a bundle on Mount Calvary as a memorial. With these charges the Patriarch, attended by other Oriental prelates, set out for Italy, to lay his case before the Pope. After running many perils by reason of the war then going on between the Pope and the King of Sicily, the party at last reached Beneventum. The trial that took place lasted several days, when the result of the pleadings for and against was, that Adrian became convinced of the hollowness of the accusations laid by the Patriarch against the Knights of St. John, and therefore refused to grant the redress sought for, namely to annul the patent of privileges conferred by Anastasius. William of Tyre, who describes the transaction as a partisan of the Patriarch, plainly says that the Pope took bribes to decide as he did. But Paggi denies this flatly, and affirms that Adrian proceeded in this, as well as in every other act of his authority, conscientiously and disinterestedly. Indeed, it is rather unfortunate for William of Tyre that the three cardinals whom he alone accepts from the charge of bribery, two, namely Octavian and John of St. Martin, afterwards figured as principal actors in the scandalous schism which rent the Church after Adrian's death. The first as Frederick Barbarossa's anti-pope under the name of Victor IV, in opposition to Alexander III, the lawful pope. The second as Victor's legate and as chief supporter, after his death, of Anacletus III, whom the emperor next started against Alexander. Peter of Blois, too, in his letter to Cardinal Papintius, describes Octavian as having passed his whole life in amassing riches wherewith to disturb the Church, and as having been but too successful in corrupting a powerful party in the Roman Curia to his views. It had always been a leading concern of the popes to heal the schism between Constantinople and Rome. Adrian did his part, though fruitlessly, towards so great a work. Shortly after his accession, he sent to the Emperor Constantine legates on the subject, who also carried a letter from the Pope to Basilius, Bishop of Thessalonica, one of the most influential and well-disposed prelates in that day in the East. This letter was to request his cooperation in bringing about the reunion of the severed churches. Basilius made answer that unity might easily be restored, as no essential difference of belief existed between the two communions, in both of which one and the same doctrine was taught, and one and the same Lamb, namely Christ, offered up for the sins of the world, though without doubt some minor discrepancies existed between the two, whose removal, however, belonged wholly to the Pope, who, as he had the will, had also the power, no less than our Saviour himself, to unite into one what stood now so widely separated. Basilius would thus seem to have been of opinion that he was in no wise cut off from the Catholic Church, notwithstanding the Oriental might differ in certain rites from the Western Church. It was an old and gross abuse of the age that the nobles asserted the right to seize the effects of a bishop on his death. This abuse did not escape severe censure from several synods, but Pope Adrian it was who condemned it the most effectually by his bull to Berengarius, Archbishop of Narbonne, A.D. 1156, on occasion of Ermengarda, Viscountess of Narbonne, renouncing the abuse in favour of that prelate, which renunciation the papal bull was issued to confirm. In the year 1150, Raymond, Count of Barcelona, made a similar renunciation by charter when about to go on a distant and perilous journey. In it, he says, "I hereby promise to God to abolish the detestable custom which has hitherto prevailed in my states, to wit, the custom whereby my bailiffs plundered the goods of a bishop when he died, a proceeding which I own to be contrary to divine and human laws. Wherefore I renounce the said custom, and order that, for the future, if anything be found in the house or grounds of a bishop deceased, it shall be reserved for his successor." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The peace which Adrian had concluded with the King of Sicily was soon seized by Frederick Barbarossa as the pretext for a new quarrel with the Church. The grounds on which the German despot professed to be aggrieved were as follows. A predecessor of his, Lothar II, had, in his Italian war in the foregoing century, obliged the King of Sicily to own the feudal superiority of Germany over Apulia. Pope Innocent II, who protested against this proceeding as a violation of his rights, could only so far induce Lothair to respect them as to agree to let their lawful owner for the future jointly exercise them with their lawless usurper, so that when the Sicilian king, as Duke of Apulia, should be presented at the ceremony of his installation with the flag, the Pope was to hold the pole with one hand and the Emperor with the other. Frederick Barbarossa renewed this right of joint lordship over Apulia by a concordat with Eugenius III, in which he expressly stipulated not to make any treaty with the King of Sicily without the previous consent of the Pope, who, however, was not required to enter into any such obligation towards the German monarch. And yet Frederick now put on the face of an injured man, declaring that what had not been stipulated had yet always been taken for granted, and that Adrian, by making peace with King William, unknown to the Emperor, had frequently violated the concordat. In the height of his ill will, an incident fell out which gave free vent to his animosity against the Pope. To settle his power in Burgundy, he summoned a diet of the empire to meet at Besançon in October 1157. This diet was numerously and splendidly attended, not only by German, but by foreign princes and ambassadors from all parts of Europe, among the rest by two cardinals named Roland and Bernard, as legates from the Pope. The Emperor received their credentials in his oratory, where he gave them a special audience, at which they also presented him a letter from Adrian, who complained in it of the impunity with which Frederick had allowed certain marauding knights to detain and plunder Eskil, Archbishop of Lund, while travelling through Burgundy to his diocese. In chiding him for so faithless a discharge of his duty as sworn champion of the Roman Church, the Pope reminded the Emperor of the favors he owed the Church, especially mentioning among them his imperial crown. Not that she repented of having so far obliged him. On the contrary, she would rejoice if she could confer on him still greater benefits. As Frederick listened to this letter, which his Chancellor Raynald read up to him, he reddened with anger at that part of it which spoke of his crown as a gift of the Church, but at the word benefits he could not control himself, for by this word he insisted, in the blindness of passion, that the Pope meant to assert that the empire was a fief of the Holy See. The fact was, the original word beneficium did signify, in the corrupt Latin of the Middle Ages, a fief as well as a benefit in general, and this was enough for the emperor's humour, who would listen to no explanation from the legates, that the word was used not in its technical but its classical sense. In the heat of the dispute which ensued, Cardinal Roland, afterwards Pope Alexander III, exclaimed, "From whom then hath the emperor his dignity, if not from the Pope?" Whereupon the Count Palatine, Otho of Bavaria, one of the courtiers present, seized by a fit of fury, drew his sword and rushed towards the cardinal, but was checked in his purpose by Frederick, who threw himself between the two, and then closed the audience by ordering the legates to be escorted back to Rome, with injunctions not to deviate from the directest line of route, nor to tarry in any ecclesiastical domain through which they might pass. Historians are agreed that Adrian had no intention in the present case of practically asserting, as Frederick in his politic wrath said he did, the feudal superiority in question. The English Pope, however, was not the less a stickler for that superiority in theory, as well as Cardinal Roland and the rest of the hierarchy, a superiority which Pope Gregory VII, supported by the feelings and convictions of Christendom at his day, taught as follows, that the Pope, as vicar on earth of our Lord in heaven, ought to stand superior over every human power, and sought to realize it as the only means of reforming the frightful disorders of that age. Frederick Barbarossa, on the other hand, took, as was natural to a man like him, bent on crushing the spiritual beneath the temporal power, the opposite side of the question, a side which was just as repugnant to the feeling of the overwhelming majority of Christendom then as it was a century before, nay, which was at variance with his own conscience, if one may judge from his conduct at a later period, when, abandoned by fortune, and his pride humbled in the dust, he was driven to hearken to its voice. For the present, he proclaimed the only doctrine which his pride could brook, namely, that he held his crown from God alone, to whose servant, the Pope, it simply belonged to perform the ceremony of coronation. This doctrine of his imperial dignity he caused to be stated in a circular, which he addressed to all the provinces of Germany in vindication of his behaviour towards the papal legates, a measure rendered imperative by the religious temper of the age. In this circular he denounces all who differ from its views as enemies of the doctrine of our Lord and his apostles, as, in short, their slanderers, and among other extravagancies of his virulence, declares that one cause, among the rest, why he so unceremoniously dismissed the legates, was the discovery which he had made of blank papers in their possession, ready signed and sealed, which they could fill up at pleasure, and which were meant to empower them to dismantle the altars, plunder the sacred vessels, and deface the crucifixes in the German churches. He further informs the bishops of Germany that he, and he alone it is, who really strives to protect their liberties against the Roman See, whose yoke they groaned under. Those, however, to whom this consoling piece of news was sent, knew but too well what a mockery the word liberty was in the mouth of a man who, like Frederick, had long ago trampled on the Concordat of Worms, and who disposed of the benefices of the Church after the arbitrary manner of Henry IV. to subserve his political ends. As companion piece to his circular, Frederick published an edict forbidding in future all correspondence between his clergy and Rome. The account which the Cardinals Roland and Bernard gave on their arrival at Rome of the way in which they had been treated by Frederick created a lively sensation at the papal court. The imperial party at the conclave sought to exculpate their patron in the face of the reproaches heaped upon him, by ascribing all the blame to the ignorance and mismanagement of the legates. In the midst of the conflicting opinions of his clergy, Pope Adrian deeply felt the indignity which he had suffered in the persons of his representatives, but did not allow himself to be betrayed into any violent manifestation of displeasure. On the contrary, after the first excitement of his feelings was over, he wisely resolved to do all in his power to conciliate the emperor without derogating from his own dignity. To this end he wrote a brief, of which the substance is as follows, to all the archbishops and bishops of Germany. As often as anything is attempted in the Church contrary to the honour of God and the salvation of souls, it should be the care of our brother bishops and of all who profess to act according to the Holy Spirit, to chastise such deeds as have been wickedly done in a manner pleasing to God. Our illustrious son Frederick, Emperor of the Romans, we say it with profound sorrow, hath lately done what, so far as we know, is without example in the times of his predecessors. For on our sending him two of our worthiest brethren, namely Cardinals Bernard of St. Clement and Roland of St. Mark, our Chancellor, he appeared at first to receive them with cordiality, but the next day, when they read to him our letter, he broke out into such violence of passion at a certain expression contained therein, namely, we have conferred on thee the benefit of the crown, that it is lamentable to think of the reproaches which he is said to have cast on them, of the insults which he obliged them to bear from him, of the dishonourable manner in which he dismissed them from his presence, and drove them out of his states. And then he issued an edict forbidding you to leave the kingdom to visit the Apostolic See. Concerning which things, though we are much troubled, yet we derive the greatest consolation from this, that he did not go to such lengths by your advice or by that of his princes. Wherefore we feel assured that by your advice it will be easy to recover him from the infatuation of his mind. For which reason, brethren, since it is plain that in this matter not only our, but your cause, and that of the entire Church, is at stake, we exhort you in the Lord to oppose yourselves as a wall before the house of God, and to spare no pains in reclaiming as soon as possible our said son to the right path, taking special care at the same time that Reynald, his chancellor, and the Count Palatine, who dared to vomit out the greatest blasphemies against our said delegates and the Roman Church, make full and public satisfaction, to the end that as many ears were wounded by their virulent speech, so many may be reclaimed by their return to the right path. And let our said son reflect on past and present events, and enter on that path along which it is known that Justinian and other Catholic emperors walked, as, by following their example, he will not fail to obtain honour on earth and happiness in heaven. You too, should you succeed in reclaiming him, will at once offer a grateful tribute of obedience to St. Peter, and assert your own and the Church's liberty. At all events, our illustrious son will learn from your admonitions, will learn from the infallible gospel, that the most holy Roman Church, built by God's hand on a most firm rock, however much she may be shaken by the winds, will yet endure throughout all ages under the Lord's protection. This brief threw those to whom it was addressed into no small perplexity, for while on the one hand they secretly leaned to the cause of the Church, they had become on the other so cowed and truckling under the iron despotism of the Emperor, that they felt themselves unequal to the task of responding to the Pope as their duty prompted, so that they resolved, after some deliberation on the subject, to lay the brief before Frederick, and to square their reply according to his remarks. These were a tissue of the most contemptible subterfuges and trifling, as, for example, that he had issued no edict against his clergy passing into Italy as pilgrims, and all others that wished to go thither on reasonable grounds, attested by their bishops, could still do so; that he was chiefly actuated in his proceedings by the wish to correct those abuses under which his churches were overtaxed, and the discipline of his convents almost ruined; that, though God had raised the Church by means of the State, yet the Church now sought to overthrow the State, a requital which he, Frederick, viewed as by no means divine; that the evil designs of the Church against the Empire were not only proved by her writings, but by the pictures which, contrary to the imperial wishes, were allowed to continue undefaced at Rome, under one of which, representing the Emperor Conrad kneeling to the Pope and receiving the crown, an inscription asserted that he did so as the vassal of his Holiness. For the rest, the bishops begged of the Pope to appease their sovereign by apologetic letters, so that the Church might continue at peace, and the Empire lose none of its dignity. Adrian smiled at the perverse spirit of pride which this reply from the German hierarchy showed Frederick to be possessed of, and took only the firmer resolution to get the better of him by opposing a calm dignity to his passion. He accordingly selected Cardinals Henry and Hyacinth, men of more experience in diplomacy than the rest of their brethren in the conclave, to go as legates on a new embassy to the Emperor, who in the meanwhile had arrived at Augsburg to review his troops, previous to his second invasion of Italy. The two cardinals, after being plundered and imprisoned on their passage of the Alps into Tyrol by robber knights who infested those parts, and aware of the quarrel between the Emperor and the Pope, thought they might thus turn it to account, but were severely punished for their pains by Henry, Duke of Bavaria, who freed the sufferers, enabled them to reach Augsburg in safety, where they had audience of the Emperor. The brief which they read to him from the Pope expressed the sorrow of his Holiness at finding how greatly the term beneficium had been misunderstood, and declared that no other than its ordinary meaning in the Latin language was intended by it, and that the meaning of fief had not for a moment been entertained. Moreover, the word contulimus, in speaking of conferring the crown, was explained to have meant, not that his Holiness had done so as though the Emperor were his vassal, but that he had simply set it on the Emperor's head, an act whereby it might be supposed that at least a feeling of thankfulness and goodwill would be produced. The brief ascribed to maliciously disposed persons the wrong interpretation given to the Pope's words, which had so deeply incensed the Emperor, and concluded by recommending to his good favour the legates now accredited to him. Frederick professed himself pacified by this brief, and as soon as some other points of difference were at his request satisfactorily settled, he embraced the cardinals in token of his reconciliation with the Pope, and loaded them with such rich presents that they returned home in the best humour. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. This reconciliation lasted but a short time, for as Adrian was not a character to tamely submit to any invasion of his rights, he could not long keep on terms with a man like Frederick Barbarossa. Towards the end of 1158, Frederick, after reducing Milan, held a great diet on the Roncallian plains between Cremona and Placentia, at which not only his German princes and prelates, but many Italian bishops, and nearly all the consuls of the cities of Lombardy, were present. A papal legate also appeared. At this diet, Frederick caused certain doctors of Roman law from Bologna to pronounce what were and what were not his legal rights in Italy. After due investigation, they awarded to their formidable client such a monopoly of fisheries, mines, customs, taxes, and other dues, under the name of regalities, that hardly anything in the entire country remained over, to which the emperor could not lay claim under that title. The consequence was, that the various towns, dioceses, convents, and chapters saw themselves deprived at a blow of rights and properties which they had long possessed and fairly acquired. It was impossible for Adrian not to look with the liveliest displeasure at such wholesale spoliation on the part of his imperial son, whose victims formerly submitted to their fate out of sheer terror and impotence of resistance. But when, in the face of former oaths and pledges to uphold and make good all the rights and properties of the Holy See, Frederick began, with reckless effrontery, to wrong that see by investing his uncle, Duke Guelph VI, with Tuscany and Sardinia, in fact, with the entire inheritance of the Countess Matilda, who, as is well known, had bequeathed it to Gregory VII and his successors forever, the Pope's right thereto having been formally acknowledged by the Emperor Lothar. When, however, Frederick began to levy tribute on other possessions of the Church, and did so under pretence of his imperial prerogatives in Rome, when from these temporal he passed to spiritual usurpations, and intruded, firstly, his Chancellor Reynold into the vacant see of Cologne, contrary to the provisions of the Treaty of Worms, to which he was sworn, and secondly, his favourite, Guido of Blandrate, into the see of Ravenna, in direct opposition to the Pope's wishes, to whose episcopal jurisdiction Guido, as subdeacon in the Roman Church, was exclusively subject, and by whom he was destined for other and more suitable preferment. Then, at last, Adrian's indignation could contain itself no longer, and he addressed to the emperor a brief, in which, under a forced calmness and moderation of style, his soreness at the outrages committed against him is yet plainly perceptible. This brief was carried to the emperor by a messenger of inferior rank, who, moreover, did not wait for an answer, but disappeared as soon as he had delivered it. This is asserted by some to have been meant as an insult to Frederick, who, at any rate, took care to view it as such. Adrian, however, was surely of too lofty a character to descend to such a petty act of spleen, and it is far more likely that the messenger, aware of what sort of letter he was carrying, and to what sort of person, did not care, under the circumstances, to do more than his bare errand, but that done, to save himself, hastened from the very possible consequences to his poor limbs of the first ebullitions of the imperial wrath. Be that as it may, Frederick determined to let the Pope see that he, too, could act as meanly and spitefully as it was pretended his Holiness had acted, and accordingly he gave his secretary orders to set in his reply the name of the Emperor before that of the Pope, who at the same time was to be addressed in the second person singular, contrary to etiquette, which even in that age required the plural number to be used towards persons of high rank. To this insolence of Frederick, Adrian rejoined shortly and pithily, rating him for his irreverence to the Holy See and to St. Peter, demonstrating to him how his present conduct belied his former oaths, and warning him lest, in seizing that which had not been given to him, he should lose that which had. Frederick, conscious of the grave nature of his crimes against the Holy See, but so long as fortune favoured him, obstinate in his pride and deaf to religious reproach, retorted Adrian's reproof more audaciously than ever. The imperial bully now bid the Pope, in plain terms, stick to those things which, as he said, Christ was the first to perform and teach. The law of justice, said he, has restored to every one his own, and he, Frederick, will not fail to pay the full honour due to his predecessors, by preserving intact the dignity and crown which they had transmitted to him. Why he was not to require feudal oaths and service from bishops who professed to belong simply to God is all the more incomprehensible to him, as Christ, the great teacher of all men, freely paid taxes to Caesar for himself and Peter. By so doing, proceeds Frederick, he gave thee, Adrian, an example to follow and a lesson of the last importance in those words, "Learn of me, for I am meek and humble of heart." From this sacrilegious irony he passes to vulgar abuse, and tells the Pope that his legates had been turned out of Germany because they were not preachers but thieves, not lovers of peace but heapers of money, not reformers of the world but insatiate seekers of gold. Did Pope Sylvester, he asked, possess any temporal lordship in Constantine's time? And did not the popes afterwards owe all their temporal power to the generosity of that prince and the rest of Frederick's predecessors? In conclusion, he remarks that it was because he saw the monster pride seated even in the chair of Peter that he felt moved to use the language he did. This letter was well calculated to provoke Adrian's deepest indignation, but as he never allowed his passions to get the better of his judgment, and always knew how to curb the liveliest movements of personal wrath when the interests of the Church were at stake, heartily tired, moreover, of the petty rubs on which the dispute between him and Frederick was by the latter ostensibly made to hinge, he bestirred himself once more to effect a reconciliation compatible with his duty and character. To this end he sent an embassy of a more stately description than had ever represented a pope before, composed of 5 cardinals, one of whom was a personal friend of Frederick, to the emperor at Bologna, whither he had arrived soon after Easter, A.D. 1159, to pass sentence on the Milanese, who, in the meantime, had again sought to shake off the German yoke. The terms which this embassy was instructed to demand as fair and equitable were as follows: that for the future no imperial agent should exercise pretended imperial prerogatives in Rome without the foreknowledge of the Pope; that no levies on the domains of the Church, except when he was crowned; that the Italian bishops should not take oaths of particular, but only of general homage; that the possessions of the Roman Church and the revenues of Ferrara, Massa, Veronola, of the Matilda inheritance, of the country between Acquapendente and Rome, of Spoleto, Sardinia, and Corsica, all acknowledged in the Middle Ages as indisputable fiefs of the Holy See, should be restored. At first the emperor haughtily refused to grant these conditions, then on further reflection offered to abide by the decision of a committee of arbitration, to consist of 6 cardinals chosen by the Pope and 6 bishops chosen by himself. But Adrian, as Frederick foresaw and reckoned upon, at once rejected this offer as derogatory to the dignity of a supreme pontiff, which, regarded by Christendom as superior to every temporal jurisdiction, could not therefore bow to one. At the same time he reminded the emperor of his concordat with Pope Eugenius, and called on him to stand to it. Frederick rejoined that he considered himself exonerated from it, as Adrian had been the first to break it by his treaty of peace with the King of Sicily. That this charge was a false one has already been shown. The emperor persisted in his proposition for a committee of arbitration. As both parties continued inflexible, all prospect of a reconciliation vanished. Indeed, measures of a hostile character seemed on the point of being resorted to on both sides. For while Frederick gave audience to a republican embassy from Rome, and appeared to listen favourably to the overtures made, Adrian openly exhorted the Lombards to persevere in their resistance to the emperor, and formed fresh relations with the King of Sicily. He also addressed a brief to the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Treves, in which he gives his feelings full vent, and asserts the superiority of his dignity over the emperor's, in the true spirit of the hierarchy of that age. "Praised be God in the highest," writes he, "that ye remain faithful, while the flies of Pharaoh, sprung from the abyss of hell, and driven about by the whirlwind, are turned to dust, instead of darkening the sun according to their wish. Thanks be to God, who doubtless hath enabled you to perceive that betwixt us and the king there can be no more fellowship. This schism caused by him will yet rebound upon his head. Yes, he is like the dragon that would needs fly through the midst of heaven, and draw after him by his tail the third part of the stars, but toppled into the abyss and left to his successors nothing but the warning that he who exalts himself will be humbled. Thus does this fox, who is your hammer too, think to lay waste the Lord's vineyard. Thus does this wicked son forget all gratitude and godly fear. Not one of his promises has he kept. Everywhere has he deceived us, and deserves therefore our ban as a rebel against God, and as a true heathen. And not only he, but also, we say it for your warning, every one who seconds him. Yea, every one who either in word or thought agrees with him. He sets up his power as equal to ours, as though this last were confined to a mere corner like Germany, to Germany, which, till the popes exalted it, passed only for the smallest of states. Did not the German kings travel about in an oxen-drawn chariot, like any poor philosopher, till Pope Zacharias consecrated Charles? Do they not still hold their court in a forest at Aix, whereas we reside at Rome? Even as Rome is above Aix, so are we above that king who boasts of his world-wide sway, while he can hardly keep in check one of his refractory princes, or even subdue the rude and foolish race of the Frieslanders. In short, he possesses the empire through us, and that which we gave him, on the supposition of gratitude alone, we can resume. Do ye admonish him after this manner, and reclaim him to the right path, to peace with us, for it will plunge you also into ruin, if there be schism between church and state. It may easily be supposed that words like these would be ill calculated to arrest Frederick's unprincipled career, nor, of course, did Adrian expect they would. He rather acted now under the persuasion that conciliation had reached its limits, inasmuch as further concessions would dishonour his dignity, and be a dereliction of his duty as chief pastor of the Christian Church, the unconditional subjection of which, under the brutal sway of the civil sword, Frederick plainly proved that it was his great aim to effect. Adrian therefore resolved, now that every advance and self-sacrifice on his side, consistent with reason and justice, had been made in vain, to arm himself with those thunders which the arm of a pope only can launch, and which the feelings of Christendom rendered so dreadful even to the most potent and hardened offenders. To this course he was impelled all the more, as Frederick, in further proof of his contempt of the most sacred obligations when they stood in the way of his ambition, shortly added to his crimes against the Church another against public morals, by wantonly repudiating, out of motives of state policy, his lawful empress, to marry in her stead Beatrix of Burgundy. Any remnants of hesitation to adopt extreme measures, which Adrian might still cherish, were completely eradicated in his mind by this crying scandal, and he at once prepared a ban of excommunication against the emperor. But in the moment of fulminating it, death paralyzed his arm. This happened September 1st, 1159, near Anagnia, in the Campania, and according to William of Tyre, in consequence of a quinsy. Paggi relates that the partisan of Frederick told a story to this effect, that Pope Adrian died by a judgment of God, who permitted him, while drinking at a well, a few days after denouncing excommunication against the emperor, to swallow a fly, which stuck in his throat, and could not be extracted by the surgeons, till the patient had expired through the inflammation produced by the accident. Adrian, however, did not excommunicate the emperor at all, but died on the eve of doing so. His body was carried to Rome and entombed in a costly sarcophagus of marble, beside that of Eugenius III, in the nave of the old Basilica of St. Peter. In the year 1607, on the demolition of this church, the body was exhumed and found entire, as well as the pontificals in which it was arrayed. it was reinterred under the pavement of the new basilica. According to Paggi, Pope Adrian IV composed catechisms of Christian doctrine for the Swedes and Norwegians, a memoir of his mission to those nations, De Legatione Sua, various homilies, and a treatise on the conception of the Blessed Virgin, performances which appear to have perished. The work describing his mission to the north must have been of great interest, for the light which it no doubt threw on the history and manners of those countries. Münter, the church historian of Denmark, mentions that he sought to discover it at Rome, but without success, it being supposed, if still extant, to lie buried beneath the impractical hoards of the Vatican. Cardinal Bozo, an Englishman and Pope Adrian's private secretary, whom he sent out on a mission to Portugal, wrote a life of his patron, but so invaluable a work is also unavailable, as no trace of it now exists. From an anecdote preserved in William of Newbridge, Adrian IV would seem to have pushed integrity in money matters to a harsh extreme, and so to have proved himself the antipodes of those popes who afterwards practised nepotism. For it is related of him that rather than award a pittance towards the relief of his aged and destitute mother out of those ample revenues which as pope he had at his disposal, but which he did not feel himself justified in diverting to private uses, he allowed her to subsist as best she could on the alms of the chapter of Canterbury. Notwithstanding the incessant conflicts of his short career, he yet found time to do something towards the improvement and decoration of Rome. To this end he projected and carried out various new buildings and restorations, consisting in churches within and without the city, in castles for the protection of the Campagna, and in additions to the Lateran Palace. The duration of his pontificate comprised 4 years and 8 months. End of chapter 9. End of Pope Adrian IV, an historical sketch by Richard Raby.